I grew up in a small, rural town nestled deep in the Appalachian foothills. My family lived in a modest, two-story house on the edge of a vast forest. There were only about 20 houses scattered along a winding, dirt road that stretched out for several miles, and most of the people who lived in the area were either farmers, hunters, or woodsmen. There wasn't much to do for someone my age in the summer, so I spent most of my time hiking the trails through the woods. I was 14 at the time, just a typical kid who liked to explore. I knew the woods like the back of my hand, having hiked the trails with my father when I was younger. But as I got older, I wanted to go further, away from the family, away from the neighbors, and into parts of the forest that no one ever bothered to go. No one really ventured that far out, and the thought of being alone in the woods, exploring untouched terrain, was the kind of freedom I craved. On that particular day, the summer heat hung heavy in the air, and the woods smelled of dry earth and the faint scent of pine. I had left early in the morning, grabbing a bag with a water bottle and a snack, just enough for a long day of exploring. It was the kind of morning when the sun was still low enough to create long, slanted shadows across the forest floor. I hadn't told anyone where I was going, as usual. I didn't need to. My parents didn't like it, but they trusted me enough to think I could take care of myself in the woods. The trails I usually hiked were well-worn, but they only went so far. This time, I decided to go deeper, past the old logging paths and beyond where the usual markers or signs of human activity were. As I walked through the dense thicket, I remember feeling the familiar rustle of the underbrush underfoot, the occasional snapping of twigs, and the distant chirp of birds. I'd passed the point where most people turned back, the road fading behind me into a labyrinth of trees and rocks. After a few hours of walking, I came upon an area that looked different. There was a steep incline ahead, a rocky outcrop with a cliff that dropped down sharply. My stomach churned with excitement. I had never hiked this far before. I was still a couple of miles from the nearest road, and the isolation of it felt both exhilarating and daunting. That's when I first smelled it. It was faint, almost like the smell of something rotten. I stopped in my tracks, my nose twitching as I tried to make sense of the odor. It was pungent, acrid, the kind of smell that sticks to the back of your throat. I remember trying to shake it off at first, thinking it was just a dead animal. But as I continued walking, the stench grew stronger. It was overpowering now, the kind of smell that made my eyes water and my stomach twist in discomfort. I moved cautiously toward the edge of the cliff, trying to pinpoint the source of the smell. I was still about 50 yards from the drop when I saw it. A pile of deer carcasses, stacked high against the rocks below. It wasn't just one or two dead animals, though. It was a whole pile, maybe 20 or 30 deer. Some were clearly recent kills, while others had decayed to the point where their fur had turned brittle and their flesh had rotted away into a gelatinous mush. There were heads scattered among the bodies, some of them completely decapitated, others missing limbs. It was an awful sight. The stench of decay was unbearable, and I gagged involuntarily, feeling the bile rise in the back of my throat. I knew immediately that this wasn't something that should have been here. Poachers, I thought. This had to be the work of poachers, but I couldn't make sense of it. The sheer number of animals in such a small area seemed excessive. The worst part, however, was the presence of fawns. Small, innocent deer that couldn't have been more than a few months old. Their bodies were still soft, barely decomposed, and their empty eyes stared up at the sky as if frozen in their last moments. I stood there for a few minutes, horrified, trying to process what I was seeing. My mind raced with thoughts of how this could have happened, who could have done something so brutal, and why they would dump their kills like this. I wanted to turn around and run, but I couldn't. I had to know more. Something told me that I needed to understand who was behind this. Then I heard something, a faint sound at first, but growing louder, the hum of engines. My heart skipped a beat. I quickly ducked behind a large hemlock tree, trying to keep as still and quiet as possible. The sound of four-wheelers reached my ears, and I saw the shadows of two men approaching the pile of dead deer. They were dressed in camouflage, blending into the woods like they had done this 1,000 times before. I held my breath, watching them unload more deer from the back of their vehicles. The men were gruff, their movements mechanical as they threw the carcasses onto the pile. I could hear them talking as they worked, their voices low and indistinct. They seemed completely unaware of my presence, which was both a relief and a fear-inducing realization. These men had been out here probably many times before, and they had no idea that someone else was watching. The men stayed for maybe 10 minutes, smoking cigarettes and talking idly about something I couldn't make out. I could hear the scrape of their boots on the rocky ground as they moved around, and the crackle of fire as one of them lit another cigarette. I stayed frozen, my body aching from staying so still, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the sweat pooling on my back, but I couldn't risk moving. Not yet. Eventually, the men finished whatever it was they were doing, got back on their four-wheelers and drove off, disappearing into the woods. I stayed hidden for a while longer, making sure they were truly gone before I finally allowed myself to move. I had no idea who they were, but I knew that they were dangerous. They weren't just poaching deer for food. This was something darker. I had no proof, but I was certain these men weren't just killing for sport. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I turned around and ran as fast as I could, retracing my steps through the dense underbrush, trying to ignore the growing sense of panic rising in my chest. When I finally reached home, I didn't even stop to catch my breath. I burst through the front door and immediately told my parents what I had seen, but they didn't believe me. They thought I was making it up, just some wild story to get attention. I wasn't surprised. I had never been one for tall tales, but the idea of someone doing something so cruel didn't seem real to them. I didn't give up, though. I mentioned it to our neighbor, a man named Dale who was a big-time hunter. He looked concerned when I told him about the poaching site, his face going pale as I described what I had seen. He immediately brought it up to the local game warden, and they agreed to investigate the area. A week later, the game warden came to the house with Dale, asking me to walk them back to the site. I led them to the edge of the cliff, where I had found the carcasses, and I pointed out where I had seen the two men. The game warden took pictures, but nothing more came of it. They found the site, and they agreed that it was a poaching dump, but the trail went cold. No one had seen the two men, and there was no evidence to track them down. Years passed, but I never forgot that day. The image of those dead deer, the smell of decay, and the sight of those two men will haunt me for the rest of my life. I'm sure it wasn't just an isolated incident, but I never heard anything else about poachers in the area after that. I never went back to those woods either. I eventually moved away from that small town, far away from the woods that I used to love so much. I found new trails to explore, new places to call home. But sometimes, when I'm out hiking, I still catch a faint smell on the breeze. A rotten, sour scent that reminds me of that day. It's hard to forget what I saw, and even harder to forget the fact that no one was ever caught. The poachers, whoever they were, got away with it. And for some reason, that always feels like the most chilling part of the whole experience. I'm not one to easily get rattled. At least I never thought I was. But after what happened that night in the Rockies, I've had a hard time shaking the memory. It's been years since it all went down, but I still remember everything with vivid detail. The unease of that night still lingering with me every time I think about it. I didn't believe in anything out of the ordinary, at least not back then. I was young, probably too cocky for my own good, just looking for the next adventure with my friends. It was the summer after our senior year, right before we were all about to head off in different directions. We wanted to do something big, something we could look back on, maybe even make into a story we'd tell our kids someday. There were 4 of us, me, Alex, Matt, and Ben. We grew up together in this tiny town tucked away in the foothills of the Rockies. Our whole lives, we'd hiked these mountains, climbed their ridgelines, and camped out under their stars. It felt like second nature, like we owned them. This trip, though, was different. We decided to go further than we ever had before, past the usual spots into the heart of the Rockies, where no one really ventured. We wanted to be on our own, away from the town and the distractions. We'd heard rumors of people getting lost up there, but it was nothing serious. At least that's what we thought. It was just an overnight thing, nothing we couldn't handle. We packed up our gear the night before, made sure to bring enough supplies, and set out early the next morning. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, a mild breeze, everything felt right. As we hiked up the trail, I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement, maybe even a little bit of nervousness. But that was just because we were about to step into the unknown. The hike itself was pretty tough, a lot steeper than we expected, but we pushed through it. We didn't stop much, just took a few short breaks to drink water and grab a snack. By the time we made it to our camp spot, the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the trees. The site we chose was tucked away in a secluded grove of trees. It felt perfect, sheltered from the wind and nestled against a small rise. It wasn't a typical campsite, but it had that raw, untouched feeling that made it feel like we were really out there, alone. We set up our tents and started a fire. The night was still warm, but there was a hint of coolness in the air as the daylight started to fade. After a while, we sat around the fire, eating dinner and talking about everything. It was nice, just us, the fire, and the sounds of the forest around us. We joked and reminisced about high school, about the dumb things we used to do, and about the future, not really thinking about the fact that we were pretty far out there. It was getting darker, but the firelight was warm and comforting. Then, out of nowhere, Alex just leapt forward and doused the fire with the emergency water we'd brought with us. I don't think I've ever been so shocked in my life. 1 second, we were all talking, laughing, and the next, the fire was gone, and we were plunged into complete darkness. It wasn't just a little flare that fizzled out. It was like someone had sucked all the light from the world. I couldn't even see my hand in front of my face. For a moment, all of us just sat there, confused and pissed. There was no reason for Alex to do that. It was such a random, unnecessary thing. "Alex, what the hell?" Ben said, his voice sharp in the dark. But Alex didn't respond right away. He was frozen, just sitting there, not moving. It was like he was in a trance. I could hear him breathing, but it was ragged, like he was struggling to get air. After a few seconds, he finally managed to speak, his voice low and shaky. "Look," he whispered. He pointed toward the ridge above our camp. At first, I couldn't see anything. The darkness was thick, and the trees around us made it impossible to tell where the ridge began or ended. But after a few moments, my eyes started to adjust. The faintest glow appeared, far off in the distance, just barely visible against the dark silhouette of the ridge. It was a fire, a big one, the kind of fire that you'd see at a bonfire, a huge, consuming flame that reached up into the night sky. I couldn't make out any details at first, but something about it felt wrong. "Is that a camp?" Matt asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I said, my throat dry. "It's too far." We all stared at the fire, trying to make sense of it. But as I looked closer, something in my gut told me that it wasn't just a group of people camping out. The glow of the fire made the dark ridge look even more menacing, the shadows stretching unnaturally. Then I saw them, figures moving around the fire. There were several of them, moving in a slow circle like they were dancing or walking in some kind of ritual. At first, I thought it might have been the flickering light playing tricks on my eyes. But the more I looked, the more real it became. They weren't like normal people, at least not entirely. They looked humanoid, yes, but their limbs seemed off. Too long, too thin. Almost like they didn't quite belong in their own skin. I couldn't quite put it into words, but there was something so wrong about them that it sent a chill down my spine. They didn't walk like people either. It was a slow, almost deliberate shuffle, like they had all the time in the world. They circled the fire over and over again, and it didn't look like they were ever going to stop. "That's not right," Ben said, his voice trembling. "What the hell is that?" Then I saw one of them standing off to the side, just beyond the others. It was a figure that wasn't moving, just standing there like it was waiting for something. It was leaning against a tree branch, its arm casually resting above its head. It wasn't a big tree, and the branch it was leaning on was well above any of our heads. I'm over 6 feet tall, and even I couldn't reach it without jumping. But this figure was just casually resting there, like it didn't have to try at all. I don't know how long we watched them. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably only a few minutes. We were all silent, too afraid to speak, too afraid to even breathe. Finally, Alex broke the silence again. "We need to leave. Now," he said, his voice low and strained. We didn't argue. We packed up as quickly as we could in the dark, grabbing our stuff and trying to keep our voices down. It didn't feel like a group of kids messing around. It felt like we were being watched, like something out there was observing us. And I knew it wasn't just my imagination. We spent the rest of the night in our tents, too scared to even leave them. But sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing strange noises from the darkness, branches snapping, something moving in the woods. But when I'd peek out of the tent, all I saw was the same inky blackness. We didn't dare go outside again. The next morning, we finished our hike to the peak, the whole time feeling like we were being followed. It was like we couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on us. When we came back down the mountain, we passed the place where we had seen the fire and the figures. We didn't really talk about it much, but all four of us had the same thought. We had to check it out. When we got to the area, it was completely deserted. There was no fire, no signs of life, just a burned-out pit in the ground where the fire had been. But the footprints were still there, scattered around like they'd been made in a hurry. The ground was disturbed, and there was a faint, musty smell in the air. And then, in the middle of the fire pit, we saw something that made my stomach turn. A small mound of charred animal bones. It looked like something had been burned there, something small, maybe a chipmunk. But the worst part was the skulls. Several rodent skulls, arranged in a way that made it clear they hadn't been burned by accident. We moved a little further to the side, where the figure had been standing. There we found blood. Not a lot, but enough to make us stop and take notice. It wasn't fresh, but it had been there long enough to dry up in the sun. We all stood there in silence, staring at the blood and the tree branch the figure had been leaning on. It was high, way too high for any of us to reach without climbing. The branch was at least 7 feet off the ground. That's when it hit me, whatever those figures were, they weren't normal. They weren't people. We didn't waste any more time. We got off that mountain as fast as we could, and none of us said a word until we were safely back in town. We called the fish and wildlife rangers and told them everything we had seen, but they didn't seem concerned. They just told us it was probably some kids messing around and not to worry about it. But the truth is, none of us will ever know what we saw that night. It might have been just a bunch of kids, but it didn't look like that. Whatever it was out there, and I don't ever want to go back to those mountains again. There's something about that place that makes my skin crawl, and I'll never trust it again. I don't care what anyone says. There's something out there, and it's not something I want to face again. The cold night air in Yellowstone was unlike anything I'd felt before. It was late October 2015, and I was alone in the park. Well, alone except for the wild creatures that inhabited the place. I'd come here to take a photo, not just any photo, but a photograph that I had been dreaming about for months. A long exposure of a geyser eruption with the Milky Way hanging over it. A stretch of stars so bright and perfect that it would make anyone who looked at it feel small. I'm an amateur photographer, but when it comes to landscapes, I know my way around. I've been to Yellowstone before, but this time I was determined to get that shot. Something about the combination of the geysers, the stillness, and the night sky called to me in a way that no other landscape had ever done. So there I was, deep in the Firehole Basin area, in the early hours of the morning, hoping to catch the perfect shot. I parked my car near a small parking area by the trailhead. The ground was soft and covered with frost, the air crisp and biting. I made sure I had everything I needed. My camera, the tripod, a few extra lenses, and my flashlight. I started walking down the path that led toward the geyser I had in mind. The only sounds were the faint crunch of my boots on the frozen ground and the occasional rustling of leaves stirred by the wind. The night was clear, utterly clear, in fact. I could see the stars as if they were right above me, their light almost sharp and crisp. The sky was so dark that it felt like a deep, infinite ocean, and the stars hung in the blackness like drops of water on a velvet curtain. I could see Orion off to my right, his stars burning brightly against the sky. Venus gleamed low on the horizon, like a jewel dropped from the heavens, so bright that it nearly hurt to look at directly. I walked carefully, not rushing. I didn't want to scare away the wildlife, especially the bison that roamed the area. They were known to be unpredictable, and I had no interest in testing their patience, especially at night when the whole park felt like a different world. The trail wound through sparse trees, and the faint light from my flashlight barely illuminated the path ahead. As I got closer to the geyser, the ground began to feel soft beneath my feet, an indication that I was nearing the thermal area. I finally reached my spot. The White Dome geyser was just ahead, a little mound of earth that puffed occasional wisps of steam into the frigid air. I set up my tripod carefully, adjusting the legs to make sure it was stable. The camera clicked into place, and I began fiddling with the settings: ISO, shutter speed, aperture, adjusting everything to account for the low light and the long exposure I was about to take. I was excited, but there was a certain stillness in the air, a quiet that made my skin crawl slightly, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The steam from the geyser swirled in the night air, thick and billowy. It would be challenging to get a clean shot of the Milky Way with so much steam interfering, but I wasn't ready to give up just yet. I stood there for a while, waiting, listening to the sounds of the night around me. The silence was deep, almost oppressive. All I could hear was the soft gurgling of the hot spring behind me, the occasional rustling of dry leaves in the wind, and the steady hum of my own breath as it fogged in the cold air. It was then that I started to hear something else. It was a deep, rumbling sound, almost like distant thunder, but it didn't quite match the cadence of the wind or the normal noises I had become accustomed to. My heart rate picked up, and I instinctively glanced around, trying to locate the source of the noise. The sound grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from behind me, far off in the distance, but it was definitely moving closer. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a bison or elk moving through the park. But then the sound intensified. It wasn't the rhythmic sound of hooves, but more like the pounding of something massive, something heavy. My mind raced, trying to figure out what could make such a sound in the middle of the night. A bear? A moose? No, this was different. It sounded like something far larger. The ground beneath me vibrated with the force of the noise, and for a moment, I felt completely exposed. My brain was running through a checklist of possibilities. The sound was getting closer, louder, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Every instinct told me to stay still, to remain calm, but I couldn't help the rising sense of unease. The noise was almost deafening now. It was unmistakable, the pounding of massive footsteps, and they were coming right at me. I froze. My body was paralyzed with fear. I was alone in one of the most remote places in Yellowstone, and there was something huge approaching from behind. The hairs on my neck prickled as the sound grew even closer. I was in a place where humans rarely went at night. The park was wild, untamed. The bison roamed free here, but they were massive creatures, unpredictable and sometimes aggressive. What if it was one of them? What if it wasn't? And then, out of the darkness, the massive form emerged. It wasn't a bear or a moose or anything I had imagined. It was a bison, an enormous bull, its massive shoulders hunched as it lumbered past me. Steam billowed from its nostrils, condensing in the cold air and creating a thick cloud around it. Its coat was shaggy and dark, almost blending in with the shadows of the night. For a split second, it seemed like the entire world had stopped moving, and I was caught in a moment of absolute stillness, a standoff between man and beast. I didn't dare breathe, didn't dare move. The bison brushed against me, its fur brushing lightly against my body as it walked by. It was so close, I could feel the heat radiating off its body, and I could hear the soft, deep grunts it made as it moved through the darkness. The sheer size of the creature left me speechless. I stood perfectly still, not daring to make a sound, not wanting to provoke it. The bison moved past me like I wasn't even there. It didn't stop, didn't glance my way. It walked with a calm purpose, as if it owned the entire land. Its large hooves cracked the frozen ground with each step. It walked past my tripod, and for a moment, I thought it might knock it over or disturb my gear. But it didn't. The bull seemed to sense my presence, but it made no acknowledgement of me at all. It continued on, its giant frame disappearing into the dark, heavy night. After a moment, it stopped about 10 feet in front of me, its head lowering. The steam from its nostrils still hung in the air, swirling gently in the cold, dry atmosphere. Then, without any warning, it began to relieve itself, a long, slow, steaming piss hitting the frozen ground. The noise was unexpected, but strangely mundane, as if it were nothing more than another part of nature's regular rhythm. The whole encounter lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like an eternity. My body was still rigid with fear and awe, my heart pounding in my chest. I waited until the bull finished and slowly walked away into the night, its footsteps fading into the distance. The park returned to its eerie silence, the only sounds now the occasional rustle of the wind and the distant calls of wolves. I stood there for a long while, trying to catch my breath, my hands still trembling from the encounter. Finally, after what felt like an age, I turned back to my tripod and camera. I didn't know if I could still take a good photo, not with my hands shaking so violently. I looked up at the sky, the stars still burning overhead, and the geyser, which had been quietly hissing in the background, suddenly erupted. The steam billowed into the night, and for a moment, I thought about packing up and leaving. But I stayed. I took the photo. It wasn't the perfect shot I had envisioned. The steam from the geyser had blurred the Milky Way, and the exposure didn't come out as I'd hoped. But in a strange way, the photo captured the essence of the night. The fear, the awe, the wildness of it all. I might not have gotten the shot I wanted, but I got something far more important. A reminder of how small and insignificant we are in the face of nature's power. I didn't leave immediately. I stayed for a while, listening to the sounds of the park, the distant howls of wolves, the soft rush of the Firehole River, and the wind through the trees. Eventually, I packed up my gear and began the walk back to my car. It was a long, quiet walk, but I didn't feel afraid anymore. I had faced the wilderness head-on, and it had shown me a side of itself I'd never truly understood until that night. When I got back to the car, I glanced over at the dark expanse of the park one last time. The stars still shone brightly above, and the night felt vast and endless. The bison had passed me by, and the geyser had erupted just as I had hoped. I wasn't sure if I would ever return to that exact spot, but I knew one thing for sure. Yellowstone had a way of reminding you just how wild it truly is, and that, in the end, was more than enough. It was a warm, late spring afternoon when I decided to go for a jog in my neighborhood. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft, golden hue over the houses. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. I had been jogging for about half an hour, my feet pounding rhythmically against the sidewalk, when I felt the need to slow down. My breathing was heavy, and I was starting to feel the sweat sticking to my skin. I slowed to a walk and took a deep breath, trying to catch my wind. As I passed the row of houses, I instinctively glanced to the right, towards one of my neighbor's driveways. It was quiet, almost too quiet. The driveway was empty, except for a dark blue sedan parked at the curb. But something caught my eye. A man. He was crouched low, almost hidden by the angle of the car. His body was bent in a way that made him look out of place. My mind immediately began to race. Why was he crouching next to the car? I slowed to a stop, my breath coming in shallow bursts. The man didn't seem to notice me at first, and we just stared at each other. I didn't know why, but the first thing that popped into my head was to greet him. Maybe I was just trying to make sense of the situation, or maybe I was trying to give him the benefit of the doubt. I wasn't sure, so I awkwardly said, "Hi." He looked up at me, his eyes wide for a split second, before quickly relaxing. He gave a short, awkward wave and said something that I couldn't quite hear. It was almost as though he wasn't expecting to be seen. For a brief moment, I thought maybe he was just working on something by the car, maybe fixing something or cleaning, but the way he stood up so quickly made me doubt that. He didn't seem like he was in the middle of anything legitimate. After a quick, almost forced exchange of glances, he straightened up and moved towards the front door of the house. His movements a bit too hasty, as if he was trying to get away from the situation. I, on the other hand, was still standing there, frozen in place, watching him go. I didn't know what to make of it. I had the sense that something was off, but I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just a weird encounter. I finished my jog, but the image of the man crouched next to the car lingered in my mind. What had he been doing there? It wasn't until later, when I was at home, sitting on my couch and sipping a cold drink, that the unease started to grow. It was a slow realization, like the pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. That guy, he had been trying to break into the car. The way he had been crouching so close to the driver's side, the awkwardness in his posture, it all made sense now. I didn't know why I hadn't seen it earlier, but in that moment it was crystal clear. He had been caught in the act and he knew it. I sat there in the silence of my living room, the weight of the situation sinking in. I had seen his face and he had seen mine. There was no doubt in my mind that he knew I knew something was off. But at the time, I didn't have the courage to confront him or even react. I had just nodded and walked away. That thought made my stomach turn. If something had gone wrong, if things had escalated, I didn't know what would have happened. I knew I should have done something. I should have called the police, or at least made a note of his appearance, but I hadn't. I had let the moment pass, just as quickly as it had come. I felt a creeping sense of guilt. I had let my guard down, trusting that everything would be fine. But in that moment, I realized how quickly things could turn sideways. I decided to take a walk the next day to try and shake off the feeling that had settled in the pit of my stomach. The neighborhood was still quiet, but something was different now. Every step I took, I was hyper-aware of my surroundings. Every rustling leaf, every distant dog barking, it all seemed so much louder than before. I couldn't stop thinking about that guy. Had he been watching the neighborhood? Was he planning something else? I kept wondering if he was still out there, hiding in plain sight. As I passed the same house, my heart skipped a beat. The driveway was empty. The blue sedan was gone, and there were no signs of the man. But the unsettling feeling lingered. Had he gotten away? Or had he just been lying low, waiting for another opportunity? I didn't know, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I walked further down the street, trying to distract myself, but I couldn't. My mind kept returning to that moment, to the man crouched next to the car. The longer I thought about it, the more the fear grew. There was something in the way he had looked at me, something in his eyes that told me he wasn't just an innocent bystander. He was hiding something, and I had seen it. As I walked, I noticed that my pace had quickened. I couldn't stop myself. I felt the need to get back home, to lock the doors, to feel safe again. But deep down, I knew that safety was an illusion. I couldn't unsee what I had witnessed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been close to something dangerous. I didn't see the man again for a few weeks. Life went on, and the neighborhood returned to its usual peaceful routine. But every time I passed that house, I would glance over at the driveway, just to make sure there was no one lurking in the shadows. I still didn't know what his intentions had been that day, but I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't be so quick to overlook things anymore. The encounter had changed something in me. I became more aware of my surroundings, more cautious of the things I dismissed as harmless. It wasn't just the man by the car that had scared me. It was the fact that I had been so close to danger and hadn't even realized it until it was too late. The world wasn't always as safe as it seemed. And sometimes, the people we pass by without a second thought might have much darker intentions than we could ever imagine. That jog, that simple act of slowing down for a breather, had turned into a wake-up call. It had reminded me that I couldn't take my safety for granted. I couldn't let my guard down, no matter how normal things seemed. Life had a way of throwing unexpected surprises, and it was up to me to be ready for whatever came next. It was a quiet evening, the kind of night I've grown accustomed to as a regular part of my routine. For the past few months, I've made it a habit to go on nightly walks in the rural area where I live. This isn't some bustling suburban neighborhood or a busy city street. It's a place where the roads are often lonely and the air feels a bit heavier with the scent of pine trees and wildflowers. A place where the sounds of nature are the only things you hear, except when the occasional car or truck passes by. I'm in my mid-30s, and I've been walking these roads for years. I've encountered my fair share of wildlife. Black bears, coyotes, bobcats, and even the occasional angry deer. These creatures don't concern me anymore. I've learned how to navigate the woods and fields around my house, how to read the signs and signals of the animals that roam there. They're more scared of me than I am of them, and as long as I respect their space, we coexist without issue. But that night, something was different. It started like any other walk. I pulled on my sneakers, grabbed the leash for my dog, and headed out the door. The moon was full, casting an eerie silver glow across the land. The night air was crisp, a little chilly, but it felt good on my skin after a long, hot summer. My dog, a scruffy terrier mix named Max, was excited, wagging his tail as we walked down the dirt road. He darted here and there, sniffing at the ground, ears perked up at every little rustle in the bushes. The road I walk on is isolated, with only a handful of houses scattered along its length. There's a stretch of about 2 miles that is completely open. No streetlights, no homes, just the occasional barn or old farmhouse in the distance. Most of the time, it's peaceful. The only sound you hear is the crunch of gravel beneath your feet and the chirping of crickets. As we moved further from home, the sound of the night enveloped us, and I felt that familiar sense of calm that walking at night always gave me. I'd walked this route countless times, and nothing ever felt out of place. Until that night. I don't know why it didn't catch my attention sooner, but I didn't hear the truck at first. I usually have a keen sense of hearing. It's one of the benefits of walking at night. The quiet allows me to pick up on even the faintest sounds. But this truck seemed to appear out of nowhere. It was a small, black pickup truck, a beat-up old thing that looked like it belonged to someone who didn't care much about appearances. The truck had a peculiar collection of rainbow and unicorn stickers plastered on the rear bumper and side windows. I couldn't help but think it was an odd thing to see out here, in the middle of nowhere. It was blaring bubblegum pop music at full volume, the kind of sugary sweet stuff that made my teeth ache just from hearing it. And it smelled, well, it smelled like cotton candy. That sweet, sugary scent lingered in the air long after the truck passed by. I didn't think much of it at first. It was late, and maybe the driver was just another oddball in the world, enjoying a late-night drive. But then, just as it passed me, the truck swerved toward the side of the road, toward me. It happened so fast, I barely had time to react. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively jumped to the side, pulling Max with me. I managed to avoid being hit, but only just. The truck drove past without slowing down, and I stood there for a moment, catching my breath. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Had the driver not seen me? Was it some sort of accident? I tried to shake it off, but the feeling of unease lingered. After a few seconds, the truck turned around. I could hear the engine revving in the distance as it made a U-turn and began heading back in my direction. My stomach twisted into a knot, but I tried not to let it show. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe the driver was turning around to go back home. But as it got closer, I could see the headlights cutting through the darkness, and I knew something wasn't right. I grabbed Max by the collar and lifted him up, pulling him close to me as I ducked into the ditch beside the road. The truck came barreling toward me again, and this time, I could hear the faintest sound, a high-pitched giggle. It wasn't the kind of giggle you'd expect from a grown adult, more like the manic laughter of a child. The sound sent a shiver down my spine. I held my breath as the truck passed, its tires kicking up dirt and gravel, the music still blaring in the background. I crouched lower in the ditch, my heart pounding in my chest. Max was shaking in my arms, sensing my unease. I didn't dare move until the truck was out of sight. But just as I thought it was over, I heard it again, the truck coming back. This time, I could hear the laughter more clearly, and it sounded almost mocking, as if it were toying with me. I pressed myself deeper into the shrubbery, hoping that whatever was happening would just pass me by. I was starting to feel that sick, creeping sensation that told me I was in danger, but I couldn't understand why. The truck slowly drove down the road again, this time at a crawl. I could see its headlights pass through the branches of the shrubs where I hid, casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. The laughter, if you could even call it that, was louder now, almost like it was coming from inside the truck itself. It was the sound of a child's giggle mixed with something darker. I held my breath, feeling my pulse thumping in my throat. The truck stopped right where I was hiding, just for a moment. I thought for sure it would see me, but then it drove on, still at that slow pace, the laughter trailing off into the distance. For a long time, I didn't move. I stayed hidden in the bushes, my body stiff with tension, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was I being stalked? Was this some kind of sick joke? I didn't know. But what I did know was that I didn't want to find out. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, the truck's headlights disappeared around the bend in the road. The sound of the music faded, and the giggling stopped. I remained in the shrubbery, trying to calm myself down, my mind racing with thoughts of what had just transpired. I waited a little longer just to be sure, but when the road was silent, and I could no longer hear the truck, I finally stood up. My legs felt shaky as I slowly emerged from my hiding spot. Max was still trembling in my arms, and I gave him a reassuring pat on the head as I took a deep breath. I decided it was time to get home, to get back to safety. I didn't want to walk any further, didn't want to risk encountering the truck again. My mind was clouded with too many questions, none of which had answers. What was that truck doing out here at this hour? Who were the people inside? And why were they laughing like that? I carefully made my way back to the road, staying in the shadows, just in case. My footsteps were quiet, and I kept a close eye on the path ahead. It was a long walk back, but it felt like it took forever. The night seemed to have grown colder, the air heavier, as if something was hanging in the atmosphere. When I finally saw the lights of my house in the distance, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I hurried inside, locked the door behind me, and leaned against it, taking a few moments to steady myself. Max hopped onto the couch, still shaking, and I sat beside him, trying to process what had just happened. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every noise outside made me tense up, wondering if the truck would come back, if it would return to finish what it had started. I never did find out who was in that truck or what they wanted, but the memory of those high-pitched, maniacal giggles stayed with me for a long time. And as for my nightly walks, I still take them, but I've never been the same. I stay on well-lit paths now. I keep my eyes peeled for any sign of movement, and I'm always ready to jump into the safety of the nearest ditch or shrubbery, just in case. Some things about that night never quite made sense, but one thing was for sure: I'd never forget that truck, or the laughter that haunted the stillness of the night. It was a sunny fall day in 2015 when Sarah and I decided to take a quick trip to a local state park in the mountains. The weather had been just perfect for a hike. Not too hot, not too cold, just the way we liked it. We had been dating for about 3 years, and despite the fact that we spent a lot of time together, it was rare for us to get away from the hustle of daily life and just enjoy each other's company in a quiet place. We'd packed a small picnic, nothing extravagant, just some sandwiches, fruit, and a couple of bottles of water, and we were eager to spend the day enjoying the outdoors. The park wasn't too far from where we lived, just about an hour's drive, so it was an easy getaway. The drive was nice. The leaves were turning golden, orange, and red, and we listened to some old music on the radio, chatting and laughing along the way. When we arrived, we parked at one of the secluded spots near the trailheads and set off on a short hike through the woods. We'd been to this park a few times before, but there was one area we hadn't explored much, so we decided to venture deeper into the woods this time. The path was well maintained at first, with dirt and gravel underfoot, but as we moved farther from the trailhead, it began to narrow, and the trees grew thicker around us. The woods had a quiet, almost peaceful feel to them, though I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unfamiliar about this place, something different from the usual trails we hiked on. After a while, we found a good spot to stop. There was a small clearing, surrounded by tall trees with thick branches that created a canopy above. We set up our hammock, tied it between two sturdy oaks, and unpacked the food. The hammock was a small one, just big enough for both of us to lie down in side by side. felt cozy, and for a few moments, everything was perfect. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground. The air was crisp, and we could hear the distant sound of a stream trickling nearby. We ate our picnic, enjoying the simplicity of the moment. There was no rush, no deadlines, just the two of us, soaking in the serenity. It was the kind of day that made you feel disconnected from everything else. It was just nature, Sarah, and me. Eventually, we both drifted off to sleep, lying in the hammock with our bodies tangled together, the soft sway of the hammock lulling us into a deep rest. The peacefulness of the moment made it feel like nothing could go wrong. That was until I woke up suddenly and without warning. It was dark when I opened my eyes. I could still see some light in the sky, a faint blue-gray that told me the sun had just dipped below the horizon. But it was getting harder to make out any details in the woods. I shifted in the hammock, trying to adjust to the change in light, and that's when I noticed Sarah beside me. Her body was tense, and her hand was gripping my arm tightly. "Shoo!" she whispered urgently, motioning for me to be quiet. Her eyes were wide, darting around the darkness. I could feel my heart rate quicken as I tried to make sense of the situation. Sarah's expression wasn't one of curiosity or excitement. It was full of fear. I could feel it too. My senses were on high alert, and the peacefulness of the moment had evaporated. There was something wrong, something off in the woods. I didn't say anything but nodded slightly, trying to steady my breathing. It was then that I realized the silence had taken on a strange quality. It was too quiet, unnaturally still, as if the entire forest had paused, holding its breath. Not even the wind stirred the leaves. The only sound was the faint rustling of branches in the distance. My mind started racing. Then I heard it, a snap, a sharp crack of a twig breaking somewhere in the distance. My pulse spiked. My eyes locked on Sarah, who motioned for me to stay still. We listened in silence. There was no sound for a long moment, just the tension hanging between us. We both strained to hear any other sounds. Was it a person or something else? My mind was scrambling for an explanation. Then it came again, a snap, this time closer. My eyes darted to the shadows of the trees. I couldn't see anything clearly, but the noise was unmistakable. It was the sound of a branch breaking, and it was closer than the first one. My throat went dry, and I had the overwhelming urge to look around, but I held myself still, waiting for more signs. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. We exchanged a few quick glances, both of us on edge, both of us trying to make sense of the situation. My hand instinctively moved toward my pocket, where I had my small pocket knife. Sarah must have had the same thought, because I saw her reach for hers too. We didn't say anything, words seemed useless now. Our breaths were shallow, our bodies tense with fear. Another noise came, a crunch of leaves, but this time from a different direction. My heart pounded in my chest. Whoever or whatever was out there was moving. I couldn't tell if they were coming closer or circling around us, but I could feel the presence. It was unsettling, and the growing darkness around us only made it worse. My mind was racing. I wanted to grab the flashlight we'd packed, but I didn't want to give away our location. The last thing I wanted was to alert whatever was out there to our exact position. Should we stay still and wait it out? Or should we move, try to make it back to the car? Both options seemed risky, and we couldn't make a decision. Suddenly, the quiet was broken again, this time by rapid footsteps coming toward us. I froze. The steps were coming closer and closer, each one sharp and deliberate. Whoever was out there knew exactly where we were. I could feel Sarah's grip tightening on my arm. She was scared. No, we were both terrified. My mind raced. The only thing I could think of was protecting ourselves. I had no idea what was out there, but it felt like we were being hunted. Should we run for it? I whispered, my voice barely audible, but there was no time for an answer. Another snap of a twig came, even closer now, and I could hear the leaves crunching with each step. I could almost feel the presence moving through the woods, closing in on us. Then, without thinking, Sarah did something that shocked me. In a voice louder than I expected, she shouted into the darkness, "We know you're out there." The words echoed through the trees, cutting through the silence like a knife. For a moment, everything stopped. There was no sound, no movement, just an eerie, suffocating quiet. It felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a few seconds. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. Finally, there was a soft rustling of leaves, and then a few shadows broke from the darkness. 3 deer bolted from the underbrush, bounding through the trees in a panic, their hooves pounding the earth like a stampede. The noise was sudden, loud, and chaotic, and it hit us like a wave of realization. We both let out a collective breath, our bodies suddenly feeling weak from the adrenaline that had coursed through us moments before. My heart was still racing, but now the fear was giving way to disbelief. It had been deer, just deer. All that noise, all that tension, and it had been nothing but animals moving through the woods. I turned to Sarah, and she looked back at me, wide-eyed, but with a shaky laugh escaping her lips. "Well, that was terrifying," she said quietly, her voice still trembling. I nodded, still processing the events that had just unfolded. We gathered our things in silence, our hands moving quickly, almost mechanically. The hammock, the picnic supplies, everything was packed away as quickly as possible. Neither of us said anything more as we started walking back to the car, our footsteps quick and uneven. By the time we reached the parking lot, the night had fully settled in, and we could barely see anything beyond the headlights of our car. The calmness of the scene felt almost surreal after what had just happened. We got in the car, and I started the engine without a word, the sound of the engine filling the silence. The drive back home was quiet. Neither of us spoke about what had happened, but the tension had melted away. We were still shaken, but we both knew that what had just happened was nothing more than a strange, unnerving encounter with nature. Still, the feeling lingered, the feeling that something was out there, watching, listening, moving silently in the dark. As we reached our neighborhood and pulled into the driveway, I finally broke the silence. "Well," I said, looking over at Sarah, "next time we pick a place with less wildlife." She gave a small, relieved smile and nodded. Agreed. It wasn't the peaceful outing we had planned, but it was an experience we would never forget. That night, we fell asleep with the windows open, the sounds of the night more familiar and comforting than ever before. The woods were beautiful, but they were also unpredictable, and that was a reminder I would carry with me for a long time. It was just another normal night, or at least that's how it started. My girlfriend, Sarah, and I were walking the dogs around the block. We'd done this countless times before, so much so that it was like second nature. It was late in the evening, just after sunset, and the air had a crisp, refreshing feel to it. The neighborhood was mostly quiet. The sound of a dog barking here and there, and the occasional passing car, the only noises that broke the stillness. I was walking both of our dogs, 2 large, energetic mutts that were a handful to manage together. They'd pull on their leashes, their noses glued to the ground, probably in pursuit of some stray scent they found. I wasn't surprised. They were always like this. On the other hand, Sarah had our older dog, Max, who was a service dog in his younger years. He was much more laid back than the other two, despite being well into his senior years. His old eyes had a way of looking at the world with a kind of tired wisdom, like he'd seen it all. He wasn't much of a puller. In fact, he was the most well-behaved of the bunch. The walk had started like any other. Sarah and I walked side by side for a while, our dogs leading the way, sniffing and exploring every inch of the pavement. I wasn't in a rush, but I knew I had to keep an eye on the dogs since they had a tendency to wander off if I let them. So, naturally, I ended up a bit ahead of Sarah, just far enough that I could keep an eye on our 2 dogs, but close enough that I could still hear her voice if she said anything. We were just around the corner from our house when I noticed Sarah had slowed down. I figured she was just taking her time, letting the dogs do their thing. I was focused on my own dogs, making sure they weren't getting tangled up in their leashes or pulling too hard. But as I glanced back, I saw her looking over her shoulder, a slight frown on her face. I didn't think much of it at first. People walked around the neighborhood all the time, whether they were taking their dogs out for a late stroll or just enjoying a quiet evening. But Sarah's expression told me that something wasn't right. I slowed down a bit, looking at her with a silent question. She didn't say anything at first, but I could tell that something was bothering her. She was still standing a little further back from me, just a few feet behind, and I saw her glance over at me, as if to make sure I hadn't noticed anything odd. But when I looked over, I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. Just the usual suburban scene. Houses with their porch lights on, cars parked on the curb, the occasional flicker of a light from an upstairs window. And then I saw him. He was standing near one of the houses, close enough that I could see him clearly, but far enough away that it felt off. He wasn't looking at the houses in the way a normal person would if they were out for a walk. He was staring at one house in particular, his head turned just enough so that he was hiding the full view of his face. His posture was strange, hunched over, like he was trying to make himself smaller. It didn't look right. He wasn't acting like someone out for a casual stroll. I was about to ask Sarah if she'd noticed him when I saw her tense up. She had spotted him too. At first, it seemed like he didn't see her. But then, just as she took a step forward, he looked up, locking eyes with her for a moment. He didn't smile, didn't wave, just stared for a brief moment before lifting his hand and giving a half-hearted wave. Sarah, a bit startled but trying to keep things casual, waved back, her voice polite as she asked how he was doing. But before he could answer, something shifted. Max, our old dog, who had been walking at a leisurely pace beside Sarah, suddenly stopped. He raised his head and let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound that was almost foreign coming from him. He wasn't an aggressive dog, but there was something about the stranger's presence that seemed to set him off. His ears were back, his body tense, as if he had sensed something that we hadn't quite picked up on yet. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She apologized to the man, trying to make light of the situation by saying that Max was just being protective, that he was a guard dog in his own way. But when she glanced at the stranger, she noticed something strange. He was staring at Max. His eyes weren't friendly, not at all. "Well, he's doing a good job tonight," the man said, his voice a bit too cold, too flat. That was when Sarah's instincts kicked in. Without saying another word, she turned and started walking quickly, tugging Max gently along with her. I could see her pace picking up, and that's when I realized just how uneasy she was. I slowed down to meet her, giving her a questioning look, but she didn't say anything at first. She just kept walking, keeping her eyes on the man as we passed him. I didn't get the full sense of the situation until later when we got home. Sarah, who was normally calm about things, was visibly shaken. Her words came out in quick bursts, describing how the man's demeanor had felt off. She said that his eyes never seemed to leave her or Max, and that moment when he spoke about Max being a good guard dog sent a chill down her spine. I still didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe the guy was just a little odd. But Sarah's unease stuck with me. We decided that for the next few weeks, we'd be more careful on our nightly walks, avoiding certain areas of the neighborhood where we'd seen the man. The feeling of being watched, of having someone who made no attempt to hide their intentions, lingered in my mind. The worst part was that we never saw the man again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been more than just some weird guy out for a walk. There was something off about the whole thing. His strange posture, the way he just stared at us, the unnerving way he had of speaking about Max. I didn't want to scare Sarah, but I couldn't help but wonder if the situation was more dangerous than we'd realized. We kept our walks limited to the more well-lit parts of the neighborhood, sticking to busier streets where we knew we'd feel safer. I couldn't forget the unease that had washed over me as I looked back at the man that night. I didn't know who he was or what his intentions had been, but I couldn't help but think we'd narrowly avoided something bad. From that night on, I was extra cautious. We both were. Max's growl that night hadn't been just a fluke. He had known something we hadn't. Maybe it was just an instinct, but I'd never been more grateful for a dog's protective nature. Looking back now, the whole thing still gives me chills. I don't know what would have happened if we hadn't walked away when we did. I never found out who that man was, and in some ways, I'm glad I didn't. Sometimes, the scariest moments aren't the ones where something happens. They're the ones where you're left with more questions than answers. It was the summer of 2016, and I was 24 at the time. My now wife, Emma, and I had just started dating, and we were still in that blissful phase where we didn't need much to keep us entertained. We didn't need big plans, fancy dates, or even a lot of people around. The small town we lived in, Cedar Hill, barely had 5,000 people, and everything was so quiet and peaceful that it almost felt like we were the only two living souls in the entire place. That is, when we would take our walks at night after my shifts at the local diner ended. The diner was a small, hole-in-the-wall place, and I worked late hours, usually finishing up around 11 p.m. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. Emma worked as a librarian, and she had a flexible schedule. After my shifts, she would often meet me, and we would wander through the quiet streets of the town. Cedar Hill was one of those places where you could walk around at night and hardly see anyone else. The sounds of crickets and the occasional barking dog were about all you'd hear, along with the faint hum of distant traffic from the highway that barely touched the outskirts of town. But there were a few spots in town that Emma and I loved to visit. One was the cemetery, which was located just outside the main part of town. It was a place most people avoided after dark, probably because it was old and slightly overgrown, and it had that eerie vibe that people often associate with places like that. But for us, it was strangely peaceful. It was one of those places where the air felt cool and quiet, and the dark trees surrounding it added to its stillness. We also liked walking down the country roads, where the streetlights were few and far between. The road would stretch out in front of us, dark and winding, and the only company we'd have would be the stars above. The feeling of the world being so quiet, so far removed from anything, made our late-night walks feel like our own little escape. But the best spot, by far, was a large field on the edge of town. It was a patch of land that belonged to an old farm, though no one had worked the land for years. The farm was abandoned, and the grass in the field had grown wild, waving gently in the wind. But the thing we loved most about it was the view of the sky. The stars there were unlike anything you'd see in the city. No streetlights or buildings blocked the view, and the sky stretched on forever. We'd go out there just to watch the stars, sometimes lying on our backs and staring up at the Milky Way. One night, we decided to take our usual walk, and the weather had been perfect. The temperature was cool but not too cold, and there wasn't a cloud in sight. We'd been walking for a while, and Emma had suggested that we make our way out to the field. We were both excited. We had heard that there might be a small meteor shower that night. It was a rare thing to get a clear sky in Cedar Hill, so we wanted to take advantage of it. The field was about a mile outside of town. A short walk, but far enough that it felt like we were escaping into another world. We reached the edge of the field, and as usual, we were alone. The only sounds were the rustling of the grass and the occasional hoot of an owl. We found a spot near the center of the field where the grass was shorter, spread out on the ground, and lay back to watch the sky. The meteor shower wasn't spectacular, but it was enough to keep us entertained. We saw a few bright streaks across the sky, and we counted them, laughing at how small they looked compared to the vastness of the universe above us. It was peaceful, and for a while it was just the two of us, with nothing else around but the stars and the stillness of the night. But then, without warning, the atmosphere shifted. At first, it was a distant sound, almost like the heavy rustling of something big moving through the brush. It was strange, and it caught my attention. Emma must have noticed it too, because she stopped talking and sat up, her eyes scanning the tree line at the far edge of the field. The noise grew louder, and I could hear something breaking through the brush, branches snapping, heavy footsteps, and grunting noises that didn't belong. I remember feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We both looked toward the tree line, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. The sound was coming closer, and whatever it wasn't subtle. It sounded like something large was moving through the underbrush, and it was moving fast. My heart started to race, and I felt that familiar knot of unease in my stomach. I wanted to get up and run, but there was nowhere to go. We were in the middle of the field, surrounded by tall grass, with the tree line in front of us. The road was a good distance behind us, and the town felt miles away. Emma and I stayed silent, our eyes glued to the dark shadows at the edge of the field. Then the figure emerged. At first, I thought it was a bear, I'd seen my fair share of wildlife in the area, but this looked different. It was too big, too powerful, and it was moving with a purpose. As it stepped into the faint moonlight, I realized it wasn't a bear at all. It was a buck, a massive, full-grown buck, its antlers towering above its head, glistening in the moonlight like some sort of natural weapon. The buck stood there, just a few yards from us, staring directly at us. I could see the muscles in its legs tensing, its breath coming in heavy huffs, and for a moment, it seemed like it was sizing us up. I could hear my heartbeat thudding in my chest, and I was frozen, unable to move. The sounds of the night had gone silent, replaced by the deafening sound of my own breath. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other. The buck didn't make a move, but it didn't leave either. It was as if it was deciding what to do with us. I had read about encounters with wild animals, and I knew that when faced with a large animal like that, you couldn't outrun it and you couldn't hide. The best thing to do was to stay calm, but my instincts were screaming at me to run, to get out of there before something happened. But we couldn't move. Not yet. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the buck slowly lowered its head, as if it had made its decision. It turned, its hooves scraping the earth as it walked slowly back into the tree line, disappearing as silently as it had come. Neither of us moved. We were too stunned to react, just sitting there, our minds racing with what had just happened. I don't know how long we sat there, but eventually, the world started to feel normal again. The sounds of the night returned, and the breeze picked up, rustling the grass around us. I could feel the tension leaving my body, but the fear remained, lingering in the back of my mind. We didn't say a word as we stood up and began walking back toward the road. The silence between us was heavy, not uncomfortable, but filled with an understanding of what had just happened. We didn't look back at the field or the trees. We just kept walking, our pace quickening as we left the field behind us. When we finally reached the road, I could feel my heart slowing down, the adrenaline fading. I glanced at Emma, and she gave me a small, tight-lipped smile, though I could see the unease in her eyes. We didn't go back to the field for several days after that, each of us silently acknowledging that whatever had happened that night had left us both shaken. In the end, we laughed about it. It became one of those stories we'd tell when people asked about our time together in the early days of our relationship, a funny, strange story about how we had a close encounter with a buck. But in the back of my mind, I'll always remember that moment, the fear, the tension, and the overwhelming feeling of being at the mercy of something far bigger and more powerful than ourselves. That night changed something in both of us. It was the first time we realized just how vulnerable we really were, and how quickly things could shift from peaceful to terrifying in the wild. And we learned to respect that wildness, to be more cautious, and to understand that sometimes nature isn't as predictable as we like to think. We still walk in that field sometimes, but not at night. Not anymore. The stars are still beautiful there, but we've learned to appreciate them from a safer distance, always mindful of the world around us. I remember that summer like it was yesterday. I was 17 at the time, and it was one of those warm nights where the air was thick with the smell of grass and damp earth. The kind of summer night where you could almost feel the heat radiating off the ground, even after the sun had long since dipped below the horizon. It was the perfect kind of night for what we always did: get together with a group of friends and play manhunt in the park near our neighborhood. Manhunt was like a twisted version of hide and seek, but more intense, more thrilling. We'd play in the dark, our only lights being the pale glow of the street lamps scattered around the park and the occasional flash of a car's headlights as it passed by on the nearby road. There was something exhilarating about playing in the dark, where you couldn't see everything and your heart raced every time a twig snapped underfoot. You never knew if someone was lurking just out of sight, waiting to tag you. That night, I was teamed up with my best friend, Ethan, and his younger brother, Lucas. We had all played manhunt together since we were kids, so we knew each other's habits well. Ethan was always quick on his feet, the kind of person who could sneak up behind you without making a sound. Lucas, though younger than both of us, had a knack for hiding. He could disappear into a tree or behind a bush, and you wouldn't find him until the game was over. We were it that night, the ones tasked with hunting down the rest of the group. We started off near the middle of the park, an area that we all considered to be the hotspot. It was a large, open space with a few scattered trees and a winding path that led to the center of the park, where there was an old stone stairwell. It wound up a steep hill, leading to a pavilion at the top. From there, you could see the entire park laid out beneath you, making it the perfect vantage point for spotting anyone trying to hide. We had just made it halfway down the stairs when I spotted two figures in the distance, way down below us. At first, I thought they were just two of our friends, probably trying to hide somewhere out of sight. We shouted out, like we always did, "Hey, who's that?" Expecting the usual response. A name called out followed by a frantic dash to get away. But instead of the typical reply, a voice shouted back, "Who the fuck are you?" Caught me off guard. I froze for a second, trying to process what had just happened. The voice was sharp, angry, and not at all what I was expecting. I glanced over at Ethan and Lucas, both of them now looking just as confused as I felt. Normally, if you were caught, you would run, but these two didn't seem to be playing the game at all. I turned to Ethan. "What the hell is going on?" Before he could respond, both figures started running toward us. Not just walking, but running fast. Way faster than anyone we knew in the game. We didn't even think twice. The adrenaline kicked in, and we bolted up the stairs, scrambling up the stone steps as fast as we could, not daring to look back. My heart pounded in my chest as the sound of footsteps behind us grew louder, echoing off the stone walls of the stairwell. Every time I looked back, I could barely make out the figures in the dark, but they were closing in on us. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning, but I knew we had to get to the top. It felt like a lifetime as we made it to the top of the hill, gasping for breath. We stopped for just a second, trying to catch our bearings, when I looked back over the edge. And that's when I saw it. They were right behind us. Not just a little ways behind, either. No more than 10 feet separated us from them, despite the fact that we'd had such a huge head start. There was no way they could have caught up that quickly. We had been running hard, and these guys didn't even seem to be winded. I didn't think twice after that. Panic surged through me. I turned around and grabbed Ethan and Lucas by the shoulders. "We have to run. Now!" Without another word, we sprinted toward the trail that wrapped around the park. It wasn't just a short jog to the road. It was a long 2-mile stretch that we had to cover to get back to where one of our friends, Jake, lived. He lived in a house just off the park, and we always used it as a meetup spot in between games. My lungs burned with every breath, and my legs felt like they were about to give out, but there was no time to stop. We couldn't stop, not with those two chasing us. Every time I turned my head to look back, I saw them gaining ground. Their figures were growing larger, coming closer, their strides unnaturally fast. At one point, I swear I saw one of them jump over a log, clearing it in a way that didn't seem humanly possible. It was as though they were on a different level altogether, and that thought only made my heart race faster. I pushed harder, my feet pounding against the gravel of the trail. The sounds of the forest at night, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves in the wind, seemed drowned out by the heavy thumping of my own heartbeat in my ears. We weren't far from the road now. I could see the faint glow of streetlights in the distance, and I felt a rush of hope. We could make it. We could get there. But when I looked back one last time, my stomach dropped. They were right behind us, no more than 10 feet away. I could hear their breathing now, heavy and labored, but it wasn't the kind of exhaustion that I was feeling. No, theirs was different, controlled, deliberate. They were toying with us. I pushed forward, urging Ethan and Lucas to keep going. We couldn't stop now. The road was so close. If we could just make it there, we would be safe. We finally reached the edge of the park. The road stretched out in front of us, and I saw the dim lights of Jake's house up ahead. We had made it. We stopped for a second, gasping for air, looking back down the trail, but there was no sign of the two strangers. The only thing I could hear was our heavy breathing and the faint hum of traffic in the distance. For a moment, I felt a sense of relief wash over me, like the weight of the entire chase had been lifted off my shoulders. We walked the last bit of the way to Jake's house, where the rest of our group was waiting, lounging on the driveway as if nothing had happened. They were joking around, laughing, and didn't seem to realize the kind of panic we had just experienced. We shared our story, still trying to catch our breath, and some of them laughed, thinking we were just pranking them or exaggerating. Others weren't so sure and suggested we go back to the park to search for those two people. But by then, it was far too late. We never found out who they were or what they were doing there. We never saw them again. All I know is that they were fast, unnaturally fast, and the entire experience felt wrong from start to finish. The way they moved, the way they seemed to appear out of nowhere, the anger in their voices, it all felt too real, too threatening. The park was never the same after that night. We stopped playing manhunt there. Some of the guys still wanted to keep playing, but I just couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. And to this day, I can't explain what happened or who those people were, but I know one thing for sure: whatever it wasn't a game. When I was 21, I was going to school at a small college tucked up in the western part of North Carolina, not far from where the foothills start to blend into real mountains. It was 2004, and I had just started my junior year. I was majoring in forestry, which meant I spent a lot of time in the woods for class, and even more for fun. That part of the state is all rolling ridgelines, tight hollows, and endless miles of old logging roads and forgotten footpaths. The kind of place where, if you didn't know what you were doing, you could easily get lost 100 yards from the road and never find your way back. But I did know what I was doing, or at least I thought I did. My college was small and surrounded by nothing. The nearest town had maybe 2 stoplights, and after dark, it was like the world just shut off. But that isolation had its perks. No traffic, no city noise, no light pollution. The stars came out at night like somebody had shaken salt over black velvet. I liked that feeling, being far away from people, out in the trees with nothing but the night and the wind moving through the branches. I think part of me liked it too much. That fall, I was doing a lot of night hiking with a few friends. It had started as a joke at first, just something dumb to do when we were stoned and bored. We'd drive out to some short trail, walk a mile or two in the dark with flashlights and laugh at how creepy everything felt, then come back and grab fast food on the way home. Turned into a tradition. I got used to being out there in the dark, and I started to enjoy it for its own sake. There's something strange about the woods at night, especially when the moon's out. It doesn't feel dead. Feels like it's waiting. I don't mean that in a spooky or mystical way. I just mean that everything gets quiet, and your senses sharpen up. Your ears stretch out farther. Your eyes pull in every detail. You start hearing things you'd normally tune out. Branches creaking, leaves settling, something small stepping in the brush 20 feet off trail. Not dangerous, usually, just different. That's probably what made me overconfident. By October, I knew the area like the back of my hand. I had maps of all the local trails pinned to my dorm room wall. I could draw the loops and elevation changes from memory, and I'd walked most of them at night, multiple times, sometimes alone, though I never told anyone that. I liked going solo. I liked the quiet. Being alone in the dark didn't bother me anymore. I thought it made me tougher, smarter, like I knew something other people didn't. It was a Saturday night, I think mid-October, and there was a full moon out. It was one of those nights where the sky looked like brushed silver. I remember standing in the parking lot behind my dorm and looking up at it, just staring. I'd smoked maybe 2 hits off a small one-hitter, nothing crazy, just enough to smooth out the edges. I remember checking the air, cool, not cold, maybe in the low 50s. No wind. Dry leaves were rustling, but only when something moved through them. It was almost too perfect. I had this little spot I liked, about a 15-minute drive west of campus. The trail wasn't in a national forest or anything official like that. It was part of a private timber tract, but it had an old roadbed and a loop trail that wound through it. Nobody really cared if students hiked there, since it wasn't posted, and it was far enough from the main road that most people didn't even know it existed. The whole loop was maybe a mile, almost completely flat, mostly through young pine and beech. It was easy walking. I had done it dozens of times. I grabbed my flashlight, tossed a hoodie in the back seat just in case it got colder later, and drove out. No cell phone, This was before everyone had one in their pocket. I think I had a cheap flip phone, but I didn't bring it since it didn't get service out there anyway. Looking back, that part makes me cringe. When I parked the car at the little dirt pull-off, I sat there for a minute and just looked out the windshield. Everything was glowing in this weird, soft blue light. The trees cast long shadows across the old roadbed. You could see every rock, every stump. It was beautiful, and I remember thinking, I probably won't even need the flashlight. I locked my car out of habit, stepped into the trailhead, and started walking. The gravel under my boots made this gentle crunching sound, just enough to remind me where I was. After a minute or two, I turned off the flashlight and tucked it into my hoodie pocket. The moonlight was enough. It was almost bright enough to read by. I followed the main trail for maybe 5 minutes before it split. To the left, it went down into a draw and looped back up around through thicker woods. To the right, it stayed mostly level and skirted an old logging clearing before curving back toward the car. I went left. I always went left. The downhill part felt more immersive somehow. The forest was quiet. A few bugs still hummed near the ground, but nothing loud. I walked slow, not in a hurry, just letting myself soak it all in. I remember running my fingers along the smooth bark of a beech tree as I passed it, just to feel something real. There was a patch of wet leaves ahead where I could hear a small trickle of water running, probably from a spring-fed seep uphill. I stopped to listen to it. Everything felt calm. Good. I kept moving. Then maybe 10 minutes in, somewhere near the farthest part of the loop, I felt something shift. It wasn't a sound or a sight. It was just a feeling, like the air had changed density. I froze, listened, waited. The trees around me were thin here, maybe 30 feet apart, and the ground sloped gently down to the right. I could see the trail ahead, curving up slightly, almost silver in the moonlight. I could also see the woods to my right, where the slope fell away into thicker brush. Then I heard it, a voice. At first, I didn't even know what I was hearing. It was low, far off, almost buried under everything else. Just a hint of sound carried by the still air. But after a few seconds, it sharpened. A man's voice, crying. Not shouting, not calling, just crying. Long, drawn-out sobs. Every few seconds it would hitch like he was trying to stop but couldn't. It was coming from the woods off to the right, maybe 50 yards away. Hidden behind the trees and underbrush, out of sight, but not out of reach. I stood there for I don't know how long. My body felt like it had turned into stone. My skin went cold. My mouth was suddenly dry. And I remember thinking very clearly, asterisk, this is wrong. Asterisk, I'm a naturally empathetic person. I help people when I can. I've pulled people out of ditches, given strangers rides, even done CPR once at a car crash. But this wasn't like that. The second I heard that sound, my body went into lockdown. Something deep in my gut told me no. Not confusion, not curiosity, just pure, immediate fear. The crying wasn't normal. It wasn't sadness. It was grief twisted into something else, like someone had gone past breaking and kept going. There was no rhythm to it, no restraint, just endless, broken sobs, sliding into weird half-words and gibberish. It didn't sound like a man anymore. It sounded like something trying to remember how to be one. I was close. Asterisk, so close, asterisk, to calling out. I even opened my mouth. But something in me slammed the door shut. Not panic, not instinct. Something old. Something that understood the situation better than my brain did. I turned around as slowly and quietly as I could. Every step felt like it echoed across the mountains. I didn't run. I didn't even walk fast. I just moved. One foot, then the other. I was shaking. My eyes kept flicking sideways, watching for any movement. I kept expecting the crying to change, to stop or shift closer, or explode into something worse. But it didn't. It just kept going. That same twisted sobbing, too far gone to make sense. The sound followed me for a while, not in space but in my head. I could still hear it even after it had faded. I don't think I blinked once until I could see my car again. When I got to the parking area, I fumbled my keys, dropped them in the gravel, bent down and snatched them up, hands trembling. When I finally got the door open and slid inside, I slammed it shut and locked it instantly. Then I just sat there. My breath was stuck somewhere between my throat and my lungs. My ears were ringing. My body had that tight, prickly feeling you get right before throwing up or passing out. I remember putting both hands on the wheel and staring at the dashboard, like I was waiting for it to tell me what to do. I stayed there for maybe 5 minutes, then finally started the engine. The headlights lit up the trailhead like a stage. Nothing moved. I reversed out of the gravel spot, turned onto the dirt road, and drove back toward campus. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't light another bowl. I just drove. Every shadow on the roadside looked like it was about to step out and block the road. I kept checking the rearview mirror, like something would be there. Back at campus, I parked in the same spot I always did. It was quiet. The dorm windows were dark. I killed the engine and just sat in the car for a long time. I finally let myself breathe. Not normal breathing, more like this ragged, shaky gasping. My body was catching up to what my mind had just processed. The fear hadn't worn off. It was still wrapped around. It was the summer of 2016 when I decided to take a break from everything and go on a long solo hiking trip through the canyons in Utah. I had just turned 31, and work had been overwhelming for months. I needed to get away from the city noise, from people, and from the routine that was eating me alive. I booked a week off and drove down from Salt Lake City toward the southeastern desert, planning to hike and camp for a few days in a remote part of the Grand Staircase Escalante area. I had done a lot of hiking over the years. I wasn't new to it. I brought my gear, maps, food, water filters, and backup batteries. I had a cheap satellite emergency beacon with basic messaging, nothing too fancy. I let my brother know I'd check in every other day. The plan was to hike down into one of the narrower canyons, explore the washes and slick rock, and camp out at 2 or 3 different spots. I liked that part of Utah because the land feels ancient. You can walk for hours without seeing anyone. My first day went just fine. I parked off a dirt road, locked the car, and set off early in the morning. The heat climbed fast, but I knew to ration my water. I reached my first camp area by sunset, found a flat spot, and slept under the stars. The next day, I moved deeper into the canyon system. The rocks were red and orange and beige, shaped by years of water and wind. It was quiet in that vast, dry space. The only sounds were the wind echoing through the slot canyons and the occasional bird overhead. I didn't see a soul. On the 3rd day, something strange happened. I had been hiking down a narrow wash that twisted between walls maybe 40 feet high. The sun barely reached the ground in some parts. It was hot, but the shade helped. Around midday, I stopped for lunch under an overhang. That's when I heard something. First, I thought it was the wind again, but it wasn't. It was a soft crunch of boots on gravel. I stayed still and listened. More crunches. Slow, not rushing. I turned and looked down the canyon where I'd come from. Nothing at first. Then I saw them. 2 men walked around the bend, maybe 100 feet away. They weren't dressed like hikers. No backpacks, no water bottles, nothing you'd need to be out here. One wore jeans and a black shirt. The other had khaki pants and a dark green jacket. It was almost 100 degrees and he was wearing a jacket. That alone gave me a weird feeling. They didn't wave or say anything. They just stopped and looked at me. I gave a small nod and started packing my stuff back into my bag. My heart was starting to race, but I didn't want to show anything. I figured maybe they were just lost or strange. I didn't want to find out. I tightened my pack and kept walking, trying not to rush. I could hear them behind me now, maybe 50 feet back, their footsteps echoing off the rocks. I didn't look back. I kept walking. After 5 or 10 minutes, I came to a wider spot where the wash opened up a bit and sloped upward. I picked up my pace and climbed quickly. I hoped they'd turn off or get tired, but they didn't. I could hear them still closer. That's when I knew for sure something was off. They were following me, not just walking the same trail, but tailing me. I took a sharp turn left through a narrow cut I knew led to a dead end, but it had a steep rock face you could scramble up and out of if you were fast. I climbed up as quick as I could, hands and boots scraping the sandstone. When I got to the top, I didn't stop. I kept running over the rock plateau, heart thudding. I crouched behind a boulder and looked back. They had reached the base of the rock face but didn't follow. They just stood there, staring up. That gave me a small window. I took out my map and tried to figure the fastest way back toward my car, which was still 2 days out if I followed the normal trail. But I could cut across some harder terrain, make it in maybe 10 hours if I kept moving and didn't rest. I made the decision then. I had to leave. I couldn't afford to stay out there another night with those guys following me. I hiked fast across open slick rock, scrambling up ridges and cutting through ravines. I didn't follow the trail. I went by instinct and memory. The sun was high and brutal, but I barely drank. I didn't want to stop. Every 10 or 20 minutes I looked back. Nothing. But that didn't mean they weren't out there. By late afternoon, my legs were aching and my water was running low. I had just crossed a dry creek bed when I heard the sound of an engine. It came from the west, faint but real. I followed it. There was a service road about half a mile out from where I was. I hoped maybe I'd catch someone driving by. When I finally saw the dirt road, there was a tan SUV parked off to the side. My stomach sank. I dropped flat behind a rock and waited. After a few minutes, one of the men from earlier, the one with the green jacket, came out from the driver's side and stretched. He looked around. Then he leaned on the hood and smoked something. He was waiting. For me. They must have circled back or had someone else waiting. My mind was racing. I thought about going back into the canyon, but I knew they'd chase me again. I had barely escaped earlier. Now they were closer. My water was almost gone. My legs were shaking from hours of hiking without rest. I needed a real plan. I scanned the landscape. About 300 feet further down the road was a sharp bend. If another car came that way, maybe they'd slow down. Maybe that was my only chance. I reached into my pack and grabbed my emergency beacon. It had a basic help button, but no GPS tracking unless I held it long enough to activate the distress ping. That would alert a ranger station, but it could take hours for anyone to reach me. I needed something faster, so I waited and watched the bend. It was maybe 15 minutes later, though it felt like an hour, when I saw something, dust rising in the distance. A car, small, white, heading this way. I knew I had seconds. I picked up a heavy stone, walked around the rock I was hiding behind, and hurled it as hard as I could at the SUV. The back window shattered. The man jumped up, startled. He looked around but didn't see me right away. I ran toward the bend and right into the road. The white sedan was coming around just as I stepped out, waving both arms like a maniac. I didn't care how I looked. I needed them to stop. The car braked hard. I didn't wait. I yanked the back door open and dove in, screaming inside without a word. The driver was frozen for a second, but when the guy in the green jacket appeared behind me, running toward the car, the driver slammed the gas. We peeled out fast, tires kicking up dust. I turned to look back and saw the SUV's driver standing there, watching us go, hands clenched. He didn't follow. We drove for what felt like forever before we hit a paved road. I told the driver I needed to get to the nearest ranger station. I couldn't explain much then. I was shaking and drenched in sweat. My lips were cracked, and my skin felt sunburned. But I was alive. Later that night, after I was safe and had water and food and my phone charged, I gave a full report to a park ranger. They asked questions about the men, the SUV, everything. They took it seriously. Apparently, other hikers had reported weird encounters in that area earlier in the month. Unmarked campsites, people being watched, even a theft from a car parked near one of the trailheads. The authorities launched an investigation. I never found out what happened after that. I never got a name from the person who picked me up, just a nod when I thanked them before I got out at the ranger station. That driver probably saved my life. I never went hiking alone again after that trip. I still hike, but always with someone else, always with backup plans, and I never ignore a bad feeling again. Back then, I lived in a small town in southern Oregon, not far from the California border. My weekends and summers were usually eaten up by hiking, climbing, or camping. I was out there more often than I was in town. I worked construction jobs during the week, just enough to pay rent and gear costs. Then I'd disappear into the hills as soon as Friday afternoon hit. We didn't have much going on in that town. If you didn't hunt or hike or fish, you usually just drank and waited for something to change. I chose the mountains. There was this one area I loved most. It was about an hour and 40 minutes northeast of town, a spread of land just off the edge of the Fremont-Winema National Forest. Locals called it Dry Creek Ridge, even though the nearest creek was about a mile off. It wasn't a major tourist area, and that was part of the appeal. No posted trails, no rangers, no signs. Just raw woods, scattered boulders, and long, narrow logging roads that hadn't been used in decades. There were patches of open ground where we could set up tents, and the granite outcrops were perfect for bouldering. We'd been going there for about a year or two before everything happened. There were 4 of us in our usual group. Me, my buddy Mike, his girlfriend Casey, and another friend named Dana. Dana and I had dated for a little while in the past but stayed close after it ended. She was probably the strongest climber of all of us. Real technical, quiet but quick to laugh when she got comfortable. We'd all met through the same climbing gym in Medford a couple years earlier. That summer, 2016, we'd planned 3 or 4 overnight trips to Dry Creek Ridge. We'd hike out on Saturday morning, haul our gear to the site, climb through the day, then camp out overnight and head home Sunday. It saved gas and gave us a few more hours on the rocks. The spot was far enough out that we rarely saw anyone else, even hunters. No cell service out there either. That was part of why we liked it. I remember our 3rd trip that summer. It was mid-July and hot during the day, cool at night. Mosquitoes were thick but not unbearable. That night, after dinner, we'd all sat around the little fire Mike had made in the middle of camp, just laughing, eating trail mix, boiling water for tea. Nothing serious. We all went to bed sometime around 11. The next morning, Dana was the last to get up. When she finally crawled out of her tent, she looked confused, kind of annoyed. She said she couldn't find her boots or her climbing pack. First we thought she'd just forgotten where she'd put them, but she swore she'd left them just outside the entrance to her tent, where she always left them. Her pack had her chalk bags, harness, extra layers, gloves, some protein bars, and a small folding knife she always carried. We searched around the site for nearly an hour, under the shrubs, behind the rocks, even up the trail a bit in case an animal dragged something off. But we never found any trace of it. It was as if the gear had vanished overnight. Mike tried to lighten the mood by suggesting a coyote or a bear might have sniffed something interesting and carried it off. We laughed, kind of half-heartedly. The whole thing felt off, but we didn't want to admit that something might have been wrong. We told ourselves Dana had maybe left her stuff closer to the boulders. Maybe she'd forgotten. It didn't add up, but none of us pushed it. She had to borrow a pair of Mike's old shoes that were too big for her, and we cut the climbing short. We packed up and headed back that afternoon. On the way home, we stopped at a diner, made dumb jokes, and acted like things were normal. But none of us forgot it. Fast forward a year, late summer, 2017. We'd gone back out to Dry Creek Ridge again, a little later in the season than usual. This time it was just me, Mike, and Dana. Casey was out of town visiting family, so it was a smaller group. The air was cooler that late in the year, especially after dark. We arrived Saturday morning, hiked in with our gear, and set up the tents in the same clearing we always used, right at the base of a long granite wall that ran along one edge of the forest. It was the best bouldering spot in the whole area. That day went well. We climbed hard, switched out gear, took breaks in the shade, drank from our hydration packs, and just enjoyed being out there again. Everything felt normal. When the sun dipped low behind the trees, we made dinner on Mike's little camp stove and boiled more water for tea and freeze-dried food. I remember Dana had her big red hoodie on, the one with all the frayed cuffs. We all sat around the fire in a triangle, backs to the trees, legs stretched toward the heat. It got cold that night, real cold, the kind of cold that tightens your throat when you breathe. But we had layers and good sleeping bags, so we managed. At some point around midnight, I got up to take a leak. The fire had burned down to embers. Mike and Dana were both zipped into their tents, just a few feet away from mine. I stepped off the edge of the clearing and moved a bit toward the tree line, far enough to not stink up the camp. There was no moon that night, or if there was, it was hidden behind clouds. The only light came from the last bit of fire behind me. When I was almost done, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. It was slow, like a shift in the dark, just past a bush maybe 20 or 30 feet away. I squinted, waited, trying to convince myself it was just my eyes adjusting. But then I saw him. He was laying flat on his stomach, maybe 15 or 20 feet from the edge of our camp, right at the base of a low ridge covered in ferns and pine needles. His body was covered head to toe in a ghillie suit, those camouflaged outfits made of netting and shredded fabric like snipers wear. I could just make out the shape of his arms, the long blur of his body, and the slight rise of his head. He was facing directly toward our camp, chin resting in the dirt. He wasn't moving, just watching. I froze. Took me a second to even believe what I was looking at. My heart slammed in my chest so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't know what to do. I just stood there, hands shaking, pants half-buttoned, staring. Then his head turned. He must have realized I was watching him. Maybe I made a sound or moved wrong. Either way, he suddenly twisted and exploded into motion. He was up on his feet and gone in seconds, bolting into the dark woods like a goddamn animal. No flashlight, no sound, just silent and fast. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I just stood there for another 10 seconds, trying to process what I'd seen. My knees were locked. Every hair on my arms and neck was standing up. Eventually, I walked backward toward the camp, keeping my eyes on the trees. I didn't say anything. I didn't wake the others. I just crawled into my tent and sat there for a while, fully dressed, gripping my knife with both hands. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I pretended nothing happened. I couldn't explain why. I guess I didn't want to believe it myself. I told myself maybe it was just a hunter, someone screwing around, some nutcase from a nearby property. But I kept glancing at Dana's tent. I remembered her gear going missing a year earlier. Her boots, her chalk, her knife. I never told Mike or Dana about what I saw. I still don't know why. Maybe I was afraid they'd think I was losing it. Maybe I was afraid it would confirm that something bad had happened back then. Something we didn't understand. But something had been out there, watching us. Asterisk waiting asterisk. In a suit meant to disappear into the woods. We packed up and left that morning. None of us mentioned it, but we didn't talk much on the hike back. That was the last time we ever camped out at Dry Creek Ridge. In the months after, I kept thinking about the guy in the ghillie suit. What the hell was he doing out there, so close to our camp, lying on the ground like that? Why didn't he make himself known if it was innocent? Why was he crawling on his belly in the dirt, watching us from the shadows? And I kept coming back to Dana's missing gear. That area wasn't near any homes or hunting land. No one had any reason to be out there that late at night dressed like that. It wasn't hunting season. There were no trail cams, no signs, just us and him. Sometimes I think he was watching us all night. Maybe even the night the gear went missing too. Maybe he'd been doing it for longer than we realized. I never went back to Dry Creek Ridge again. I stopped climbing for a while. I still hike sometimes in safer places with more people, but I don't camp out anymore. Not unless it's at a public site with bathrooms and other people around. Some nights, when I'm alone in my apartment and I turn off the lights, I think about that ridge. I think about the cold ground, the firelight, and that shape in the dark with eyes fixed on us from the dirt. And I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't seen him. It was early fall in 2017, and I had just turned 23 a few weeks earlier. I was still living in the same small town I'd grown up in, Colby Creek, Oregon, a quiet place that sits in the shadow of the Western Cascades. Most people around here turn in early, especially on weeknights. But for some reason, I had developed the habit of taking long, quiet walks around town well after midnight. It helped me clear my head. I wasn't sleeping great at the time, and there was something peaceful about the stillness of empty streets, the soft glow of porch lights, and the low hum of distant highway noise. It wasn't something I thought twice about, just something I did a few times a week without ever expecting anything unusual to happen. But one night, that changed. It was a Tuesday, I think mid-October, the kind of night where it's just cold enough to see your breath in the air, and the sky was totally clear. I remember because I stood on the front porch for a few seconds just looking up at the stars. The wind was light. No cars passed while I stood there tying the laces of my old hiking boots. I had on an old black hoodie, a faded pair of jeans, and a knit cap I'd had since high school. I left my phone charging in my room. I didn't bring earbuds. I liked hearing the sounds of the town. Distant dogs barking, wind moving through trees, the occasional owl. It made me feel more grounded. I locked the door and stepped down the wooden steps that creaked under my weight, hands in my pockets. It was 1:36 a.m. when I checked the clock on the microwave before heading out. I know that number because it burned into my memory afterward. I headed down Shiloh Street first, the street I lived on. It's one of those older neighborhoods. Long blocks, no sidewalks, and dim yellow streetlights spaced way too far apart. Houses were set back from the road, with thick hedges and tall pine trees cutting off most of the view. I knew every corner and mailbox, every dog that barked when I walked past their yard. My route that night was nothing special, just a slow loop around the eastern part of town. I wasn't in any rush. I passed the elementary school, took a right on Crestwood Lane, then followed Elm until it turned into Pineview. All of it felt routine. I passed some empty parks, walked by the darkened windows of the diner where I sometimes got breakfast, and made my way past the auto body shop that always had a broken security light flashing like a strobe in one corner of the lot. By then, it was probably close to 2 a.m. I turned west to head back toward my place, cutting through a few smaller side streets. It's funny, for how much I walked those roads, I can't recall ever seeing anyone else out at that hour. It was always just me and the occasional raccoon or stray cat. That night was no different until I hit Holloway Drive. That's when I noticed the van. It was a black cargo van. No logos, no writing on the side, no windows in the back. It didn't have its high beams on, and it moved slowly. Not like crawling slow, but just off enough that it made me notice. I didn't think anything of it at first. Delivery vans, late-night workers, night shift security guys, it could have been anything. But it was just the way it came down the street that caught my eye. I kept walking like normal. I heard the low hum of its engine as it passed behind me, and then it disappeared around a bend. I was maybe half a block from where Holloway meets Randall Avenue when I saw the van again. It came down Randall, turned back onto Holloway in the opposite direction, passing me for a second time. This time it went slower. I noticed that it didn't have a front license plate, which isn't legal in Oregon. And I couldn't see the driver. The windshield was too dark. Again, I didn't panic, but something about it made my stomach tighten just a little. I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe the guy was lost. Maybe he was a contractor or a night cleaner or something. It was a weird hour. Weird things happen. Still, I shifted to the other side of the street, walking a bit quicker now. I turned off Holloway and cut across Larch Street. It was narrower and even less lit than the other roads. My boots hit patches of fallen pine needles as I kept an eye on the intersections behind me. 7 or 8 minutes passed. I was just about to cross Maplewood Avenue when I heard it again. That low, rolling engine noise. I looked back and, sure enough, there it was. Same black van, same slow approach. It came down Maplewood and rolled past the end of the block. I could see now no rear plate either, just a blank metal bumper. That time, it didn't just pass through. It stopped. It stopped in the middle of the street, idling just a few houses ahead of where I was walking. I froze for a second. My instincts kicked in, not like a loud alarm, more like a quiet push in my gut saying, "Nope." Without even thinking it through, I turned on my heel and started walking the other way, back toward where I came. Then I picked up the pace. I didn't run, not yet, but I walked fast and cut right onto a side street I didn't usually take. Brantley Court, I think. I had no idea if it looped around or dead-ended. I just wanted out of view. I moved quickly and took another left onto Pinecrest Way. I glanced over my shoulder, heart starting to pound now. I couldn't hear the van anymore, but I didn't feel safe. There was no one outside. Every house was dark. All I could hear was my own boots scuffing on the pavement and the sound of my breath getting sharper. I wasn't just walking anymore. I was half jogging. I made 2 more quick turns. I think I was on Cinder Lane now, and then I cut into someone's yard. I don't even know why I picked that house. It was one of the few with a split rail fence and some decent hedges. I hopped over the fence and crouched low, moving through a narrow space between 2 bushes until I reached the far side of their backyard. There was a thick tree there, maybe an old spruce, and I ducked behind it, crouching low, trying to stay completely still. That's when I heard it again. The van. This time it moved much slower. I didn't peek out, didn't stand, didn't move at all. I just listened. Tires rolled gently down the road. The sound stopped. Then I heard the idle. A low, quiet purr. It must have been right in front of the house I was hiding behind. And then, nothing. No door opened. No movement. No footsteps. Just the sound of the engine running. I stayed behind that tree, back pressed against rough bark, legs starting to cramp from crouching so long. My breath came out in thin little clouds that faded into the dark. I stayed there, barely moving, for what felt like an eternity. Realistically, it was maybe 20 minutes. Eventually, I heard the van pull away. Even then, I waited another 5 minutes before I moved. When I finally stood up, my legs were shaking from adrenaline and stiffness. I didn't climb back over the fence. I went through the yard, past the side gate, and slipped back out onto the next street. I kept close to the trees, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. I didn't see the van again after that. I cut through 3 different back streets, climbed over a storm ditch, and finally hit the hill that led back to Shiloh Street. By the time I reached my block, my hoodie was soaked with sweat, and I could barely feel my fingers from the cold. I sprinted the last half block and didn't bother using the front door. I went around the side, grabbed the drain pipe to the side of the house, and climbed up onto the porch roof, then through my bedroom window like I was still in high school, sneaking in late. Once inside, I locked the window, pulled the shades, and just sat there on the edge of my bed for a long time. My heart wouldn't stop racing. My hands were shaking. I kept thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't run, if I'd kept walking, if I'd ignored my instincts. That van had circled around 4 times. And it had no plates, no markings, no reason to be out driving those streets over and over at 2 a.m. I don't think they were lost. I don't think it was a coincidence. I think they were looking for someone, or waiting for someone to be alone. I didn't report it. I didn't have enough detail, no plates, no solid description of the driver or even what model van it was. Just an old black cargo van without plates, creeping through town at night. I told myself that maybe I was overreacting, that maybe it wasn't what it seemed, but I never went out for a walk that late again. Not once. Now, whenever I hear a van's engine pass by, especially at night, my body tenses up without me even meaning to. I still go for walks sometimes, but only in the early evenings just before sunset. I keep my phone on me now. I stay on main roads. I keep a flashlight in my jacket. The weirdest thing is, for how small this town is, I've never seen that van again, not in daylight, not anywhere, not even once. And every now and then, when I'm walking alone, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, listening for that low, idle hum in the distance, and remembering how quiet it got that night, just before everything changed. It was a mild autumn evening, the kind where the air still carries a little warmth from the day. But the promise of winter is beginning to creep in as the sky darkens faster with every passing week. I was 26 at the time, living in a small town not too far from a bustling city, working a low-paying job at a grocery store. It was nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills. I'd finished my shift around 7 p.m. like usual, but on this particular evening, I'd agreed to cover an extra shift for a coworker who had a family emergency. So I didn't leave work until close to 11 p.m. I had taken this late shift a few times before, but it never felt like much of an inconvenience. The streets were quieter, and the area around the store was less crowded. I felt a little more at peace walking home later in the evening, but that night, that sense of calm was shattered in an instant. I lived about a 25-minute walk from the grocery store, and my usual route took me along the streets, past rows of houses, and then down a quiet trail behind some old train tracks. The trail was less traveled, but it was quicker, and it allowed me to avoid the traffic on the main road. It was a bit isolated, sure, but it was safe enough during the day. At night, though, something about it felt different. The further I walked that evening, the more I noticed the change in the atmosphere. The air was still warm but carried a distinct crispness that seemed more pronounced when the sun had gone down. The sounds of traffic, the hum of nearby businesses, the usual background noise of suburban life were all but absent. There was just the quiet of the trail and the faint sound of the wind rustling through the trees, which felt unnervingly loud under the darkening sky. I'd taken this route countless times, but this night, it felt different. As I made my way down the trail, I rounded a bend and saw something up ahead, not far from where the train tracks intersected the path. A man was lying on the ground next to his bike. I could see the faint outline of the bike's frame against the dim light coming from the street lamps in the distance. The man was moaning, but the sound was off. It didn't sound like genuine pain. It was a strange, almost theatrical kind of moan, slow and drawn out, like someone faking an illness, a kind of exaggerated, "I'm hurt" noise you hear from a kid who wants attention. It didn't feel real. My mind immediately went to the thought that maybe he was just having a rough time, maybe drunk or high, or maybe even playing some strange joke. I wasn't sure, but I instinctively slowed my pace to take a better look. I figured I could help him if he was really in trouble, but something was wrong. His bike wasn't just lying there in a heap. It was standing upright on its kickstand, perfectly positioned as if he had put it there before falling to the ground. That didn't add up to me. If he was truly in pain or hurt, why would he go through the trouble of propping up his bike first? As I drew closer, I could see his face more clearly in the dim light. He was a middle-aged man, disheveled and unkempt, wearing a jacket and jeans. His hands were still resting on the ground, and he was staring off into the trees, not looking at me at all. Then he turned his head slightly and saw me coming. His expression was a strange mix of confusion and something else, maybe a little too eager. He called out to me, but the tone of his voice didn't match the situation. Hey, can you help me? I'm hurt. I need some help." The way he said it sounded wrong, like he was trying to sound pitiful, but I could hear the edge of impatience in his voice, like he was hoping I would hurry up and come over to help him. The whole scene struck me as odd, and I didn't want to take any chances. I instinctively stepped back, a gut feeling telling me to avoid getting closer. I continued walking, keeping my eyes on the ground ahead. I didn't know what this man was up to, but I wasn't about to find out. I was already too close to him for comfort, and I didn't like the way he was watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I turned around and started heading back the way I came. The trail wasn't very wide, so I stayed on the edge, hoping I could get back to the street without incident. My heart started to beat a little faster, and a tight knot formed in my stomach. There was a nervous energy building in my chest, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I heard the faint rustling sound behind me. My pace quickened, and I could feel the tension rising with every step. Then, the sound I had been dreading came, shuffling footsteps behind me, quick and deliberate, followed by the man's voice. But this time, it was filled with anger. "I'm gonna kill you, motherfucker." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I froze for a moment, disbelief coursing through my veins. It didn't make sense. The man had been moaning in pain a second ago, and now he was threatening me like he was some kind of predator. I didn't even think twice. My body reacted instinctively. I turned and sprinted up the incline toward the railroad tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. My breath was sharp and ragged, and I could feel the adrenaline surging through my body as I pushed myself faster. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear him pedaling hard, his bike tires screeching against the pavement as he gained on me. His speed was picking up, and I knew he was getting close. Every step I took, every inch I gained, I felt him right behind me. He was close enough that I could hear his ragged breathing, the sound of him closing the distance. I reached the tracks and leapt over the metal railings without thinking. My foot caught the edge slightly, but I didn't let it slow me down. I heard the sound of his bike hitting the tracks behind me, then a loud crash, a sickening thud of metal against pavement, and the sound of him screaming in pain. I didn't dare turn around, but the thought of him tumbling over the handlebars and landing hard on the ground gave me a small moment of relief. He was out of the picture for now, but that didn't mean I was safe. I kept running, my breath coming in short bursts, my legs burning as I pushed myself to the limit. I could hear him moaning behind me, but the sound was different now. It was real. He was in genuine pain. I kept running until I reached the gas station at the edge of the neighborhood. It was still open, the fluorescent lights flickering in the quiet night. I made my way over to the payphone, feeling the sharpness of the cold air on my skin as I fumbled with the change in my pocket. I dialed the police, my fingers shaking as I recounted what had happened. Everything, from the strange man by the bike to the sudden threat, the chase, and the crash. It felt surreal as I spoke, like I was still in shock. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting the man to come running after me, but nothing happened. The phone call lasted only a few minutes before the operator told me the police were on their way. When the officers arrived, they listened to my story with a professional detachment, but I could see the subtle smirks on their faces as I described the man's fall. One of the officers leaned in a little closer. "Yeah, we know him. He's a village idiot, always pulling stunts like this. Tries to rob people, gets hurt, and ends up calling for help. We've had to pick him up more times than I can count after he biffs it on his bike." I wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or disgusted. The idea that this guy had been so ridiculous, so desperate to harm someone for whatever reason, made me feel sick. But there was something else gnawing at me too. The officer's words echoed in my mind. He's been doing this for years. It was unsettling to think that this wasn't an isolated incident, that someone would resort to such a strange and dangerous scheme just to steal from others. When I told the officer about the threat the man had made against me, he chuckled. Dude wasn't even armed. He's just some idiot who gets his ass handed to him every time he tries something like this. The officer seemed amused by the idea that this guy had made such an empty threat. But I didn't find it funny. I still couldn't shake the image of the man rushing toward me, his eyes wild with a strange kind of hunger, and the way his whole demeanor had changed from the moaning, helpless figure on the ground to a predator. It was like flipping a switch. After the police took the man into custody, I stood by my car for a while, taking deep breaths to steady myself. The adrenaline finally started to wear off, leaving me feeling drained and shaky. But even though I had made it out of that situation without harm, I couldn't forget the way things had unfolded. There was a lingering sense of unease, like I had narrowly avoided something far worse. I didn't walk that trail again for a long time. Every time I thought about it, I remembered that night and the man who had turned from someone seemingly in pain to someone ready to kill. I don't know what his intentions were that night, but I'm glad I didn't stick around to find out. I still walk home sometimes, but I'll never forget that night when the quiet trail turned into something much darker than I ever expected. My name's David, and I live in a small town called Ridge Lake, tucked in the northwestern part of Oregon. It's not the kind of place that gets mentioned on road signs. The people here are quiet, mostly logging families or older folks who grew up with the woods at their back door. I've been here most of my life. Moved when I was 7, stayed through school, never really found a reason to leave. Now I'm 32 and still in the same town. Same small house I rent on the East Edge, with the same routines I've been keeping since I was a teenager. One of those routines is hiking. I've always felt comfortable in the woods. Some people get nervous when they don't hear traffic or voices, but for me, the silence is the best part. Ridge Lake sits in a valley surrounded by a thick patchwork of pine, fir, and cedar forests. Some parts of the woods are used for logging, some for camping and trails, but if you head far enough out, there are places where it feels like nobody's been in decades. And I like that. I've got this one trail I follow. Doesn't have a name on any map, but I've walked it so many times I could trace it in my sleep. It starts behind an old fence line at the edge of town, past a set of rusted gates that lead nowhere now, and winds through the trees until you reach a split in the trail. One way curves toward the lake, a little-known fishing spot. The other dips into a denser part of the forest, the kind where sunlight barely gets through the trees. That's the way I usually go. There's no real trail after a point. You just follow natural clearings and deer paths until you don't hear anything from town anymore. That's where I like to be. I do a lot of these hikes late. Sometimes I don't even start until it's well past dark. I work construction, and sometimes the only peace I get is late at night when everyone's asleep. I'd pack a thermos of coffee, throw on a headlamp, and just go. I've done this enough times that I can tell the time of night by how the wind feels and how far along I am in the woods. Most nights I'll find a clearing and sit there until the sun starts coming up. That golden light through the trees, the way the fog settles low over the underbrush, it makes you feel like you're the only person on Earth. This story happened in late October 2022. I remember because it was the week before Halloween, and the leaves were in that perfect stage where everything's dry and crunchy underfoot, but the cold hasn't really set in yet. The air was crisp, and the moon was out in full, casting this pale light through the trees. It was maybe a little after 11 p.m. when I headed out. I followed my usual trail, past the gates, crossed the small creek about a mile in, and kept going deeper. The moonlight made the headlamp unnecessary at points, and everything felt calm. I had that thermos of coffee in my hand, one of those insulated ones that keeps it hot for hours, and I was sipping slowly as I walked. I didn't hear anything unusual, not at first, just the usual night sounds. Distant rustle of raccoons or squirrels, the occasional owl, the wind moving through the higher branches. About 2 hours in, I came across something strange. I just rounded a shallow ridge where the trail drops slightly into a flatter, lower area, a kind of bowl surrounded by trees, and noticed something that didn't belong. From that distance, maybe 70 or 80 feet away, I saw shapes in the dark. Squat, blocky shapes that didn't fit the natural lines of the forest. I switched my headlamp back on and aimed it toward the clearing. There were structures, several of them. I moved closer, slowly, carefully, because even out here, you don't just stumble into someone's camp. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Wood smoke, recent, not old or stale. There was a faint chemical odor too, like burnt plastic. Then I saw the source. In the middle of the clearing, someone had made a fire pit out of an old rubber tire. The fire was still going, small but steady, mostly coals and embers, with the faint flicker of flame licking at the center. Around it were what I can only describe as shanties, little makeshift shelters built from scraps of plywood, corrugated metal, old doors, tarps, and even blankets strung over sticks. Some were leaning, barely holding together. Others looked more solid, like someone had spent time making them livable. In total, I counted at least 8 of them, and there were signs of even more being started. Pieces of wood stacked, nails half driven into trees, garbage bags tied up like supplies. But no one was there. That was the part that stopped me cold. Everything about the scene screamed occupied. The fresh fire, the organized shelters, even a few buckets and old cookware scattered around. One hut had an open box of cereal on a makeshift table. Another had an old backpack resting against the side. There were shoes, pairs of them, set just outside a few of the shelters, like whoever had been living there had just stepped inside for a moment. But there was no one, not a single sound except the crackle of the fire and the wind in the trees. I stood there for a long minute trying to understand what I was looking at. It didn't make any sense. This place was far enough from any road that it would have taken hours just to haul all this stuff in. And I hiked this area at least 3 times a week. I'd never seen anything here before. It was as if the whole place had appeared overnight. My first thought was maybe I'd stumbled into some kind of temporary camp. Maybe squatters, maybe a group of people trying to stay off the grid. But why leave the fire going? Why leave food, shoes, gear? I walked closer to the fire pit and knelt beside it. The embers were still hot. I could feel the heat on my face. Someone had been here very recently. I looked around again. Still no movement. I stood up and began carefully checking the huts. I didn't want to touch anything. I'm not the kind of person to snoop, but I needed to know if someone was nearby, maybe watching, maybe hiding. I listened. Nothing. Not even the usual night sounds anymore. No animals, no birds, just that fire. One hut had an old sleeping bag inside, unzipped, with a pillow at one end and what looked like a jacket bunched up near the foot. Another had some plastic crates filled with random stuff, empty water bottles, socks, cans of food, a broken radio. I didn't go through it, just looked. It all felt too strange, like I was in the middle of something I wasn't supposed to see. That uneasy feeling started to grow, the kind where your skin feels cold and tight, and every sound makes you turn your head. I don't scare easily. I've seen my fair share of strange things out in the woods. People hunting in the wrong season, kids lighting fireworks, drunk campers. But this was different. This felt wrong, like everyone had just vanished. I backed away from the huts and moved back toward the edge of the clearing. I didn't run, but I didn't walk slow either. I kept my headlamp on, sweeping the trees, checking every shadow. I made it back up the ridge and looked back one more time. Still no one. The fire flickered behind me like a lighthouse in the dark, but nothing moved. I didn't stop walking until I was back near the creek where the trail splits. I stood there, breathing heavy, trying to figure out what I'd just seen. I didn't have cell signal out there, but even if I did, who was I going to call? The sheriff? Tell them there's a creepy ghost town in the woods? I had no proof, no pictures, just the sight burned into my mind. When I finally got home, it was past 4 a.m. I sat on my porch for over an hour, staring at the woods. My clothes smelled like smoke. I didn't sleep. The next day, I went back. In daylight, I waited until noon, brought my pack, my camera, and a printed map in case something happened. I followed the exact trail, passed the same landmarks, climbed the ridge, and found nothing. The clearing was there. The trees were there. But the shanty town was gone. Completely. No huts, no fire pit, no garbage, no signs that anyone had been there. Not a single broken branch or footprint. The ground where the fire had been looked clean, undisturbed. It was like the whole thing had been erased. I stood in the middle of that empty clearing, turning in slow circles, trying to line it up with what I'd seen the night before. I knew I hadn't dreamed it. I could still smell it on my jacket. But there was nothing to prove it, nothing to show. For the next few weeks, I didn't hike that trail again. Not at night. I tried to forget it, tell myself it was some strange one-night thing. Maybe a group of transients who packed up fast. But who packs up everything that clean, that fast? Why light a fire and leave it? Eventually, I returned. Not because I was brave, just because the woods are home, and I didn't want fear to keep me out. I still hike, though I stay closer to town now. I haven't seen the shanty town again. But sometimes, when I'm sitting in a clearing at dawn, drinking coffee and watching the light rise over the trees, I think about it. I think about how quiet it was, how carefully everything had been placed, how quickly it was all gone. And I wonder if anyone else ever saw it. I never told anyone in town. What would I say? I just keep walking, eyes open, ears sharp, and I don't go as deep into the woods as I used to. Not anymore. It was the summer of 2016, late July, just after a week-long stretch of working overtime. I was 28 then, living in New Mexico, working construction in Las Cruces. That job wore on me. Hot days, early mornings, long shifts. But when the weekend came around and someone mentioned getting out into the wilderness for a few days, I was all in without a second thought. We weren't really hiking types, at least not on this trip. This was more like car camping. Pulling deep into BLM land with coolers of beer, folding chairs, and enough food to last through Sunday. We had 3 cars between the 8 of us. Me, my buddy Chris, and his cousin Dylan were in one truck. Then there was Josh and Emily in her Subaru, and finally Brooke, Katie, and Lexi in Brooke's old Cherokee. We were a tight group. Some of us had been friends for years, others newer additions through jobs or roommates, but we all trusted each other. Everyone was mid-20s to early 30s. Nobody was flaky or weird. We were all just looking for a break from screens, work, and the weight of day-to-day life. Chris was the one who picked the spot. He'd been out that way a few times, northern New Mexico, past Taos, not far from the Colorado border. There was a winding Forest Service road off a 2-lane highway, marked on some old BLM maps but barely visible on Google. He said he'd been out there years before and hadn't seen a soul. That was the kind of camping we wanted. No crowds, no noise, no ranger checking permits. Just us, a fire, and the trees. We left town Friday morning, around 10 a.m., and made decent time. Took Highway 64 up, passed through a few towns, and then veered off onto the forest road Chris mentioned. That's where the real driving began. It was more than an hour and a half of gravel and washboards. Trees closed in around us the deeper we went. Big ponderosa pines, some spruce, thick underbrush. The road narrowed until we had to crawl at 10 miles an hour. But it was worth it. We found a wide, flat clearing tucked into a bend in the hills. About 50 yards from the road, enough space for 3 cars and a circle of tents around the fire pit someone had clearly made years ago. There was a log for sitting, some old charred rocks, even a half-buried grill grate. And the best part? Silence. No other people, no tire tracks, no trash. It felt like we were the only people for miles. We got to work setting up. Dylan and I pitched our tent next to a small rise near the treeline. Emily and Josh parked farther back, closer to the road, and the girls set up on the opposite end of the clearing. By late afternoon, we had a good fire going, chairs out, and were starting on dinner: grilled sausages, chips, corn on the cob cooked in foil over the fire. We had music playing from one of those portable speakers, but low. Nobody wanted to ruin the quiet. The sun dipped behind the ridge around 7:30, and the temperature dropped fast. We pulled on hoodies, passed around a bottle of whiskey, and just sat. The stillness out there was something I'd never quite felt before. Not even birdsong, just the wind moving through the trees, the occasional crackle of wood on the fire, the murmur of us talking low. It wasn't until just before full dark that we even remembered the cars. We hadn't touched them since we parked. They were lined up at the edge of the site, maybe 30 yards from the tents and fire, right where the clearing met the trees. Chris said he was going to grab his charger and check something in the truck. So we all decided to head over, grab last-minute stuff, then settle in for the night. I remember the moment I noticed something was off. Chris was crouched by his front tire, and I saw his hand freeze mid-reach. He stared at the tire, then touched it. I didn't think much at first. Maybe it had gone flat from the road. Then Josh cursed and pointed at his own car. The right front tire on each of our 3 cars was flat. But not just flat, slashed. You could see the clean tear in the sidewall, just above where the rubber met the dirt. It wasn't a puncture and it wasn't a blowout. It was a slice. Long, sharp, precise. I walked over to the Subaru and squatted down. You didn't need to look close. It was clear someone had taken something sharp, maybe a box cutter or razor, and dragged it in one smooth motion. The rubber peeled slightly outward from the cut, like a flap. We didn't say much at first, just sort of stood there, each one checking their own car, not quite understanding what we were seeing. For a second, I think everyone thought the same thing, that it was some kind of prank. But the more we looked, the colder it got inside. The cuts were all identical, same tire, same location, same kind of slice. And the more you thought about it, the worse it felt. Nobody had been near the cars since we got there. We would have heard someone. You could hear cars from a mile out on that forest road. You could see headlights through the trees from even farther. There were no other people, no signs of anyone. The ground was dry and dusty, no footprints, no tire tracks but our own. I started feeling sick to my stomach. Not from the tire, but from the idea that someone had walked into our camp without being seen or heard, moved between the cars and slashed the tires, then vanished. That kind of thing doesn't feel real when you first start to process it. Your brain looks for every possible explanation. Maybe a prank, maybe a weird coincidence, maybe even some sort of road debris we all hit. But none of those make sense, and deep down, we all knew it. The cuts were too clean, too deliberate. The panic didn't hit all at once, crept in. Josh was the first to start swearing nonstop. Emily backed away from the cars and wouldn't get close again. Dylan just stood with his arms crossed, silent, staring into the dark trees like he was expecting someone to step out. Chris was the only one who moved with purpose. He went straight to the truck, popped open the side box, and pulled out a revolver. He held it low at his side, not pointing it, not waving it around, just holding it. That was when the fear fully settled in. The way he moved, the way his face looked, it wasn't a joke anymore. None of us had cell service. We'd lost signal an hour before reaching the campsite. No way to call anyone, No way to get help until we were back on the highway. It was getting dark fast, and the forest around us, which had felt peaceful and still before, now felt suffocating, like it was holding its breath. We got moving. Everyone grabbed their spare tires and started changing them. The process felt agonizing. Every sound, a twig snapping, the wind rustling leaves, felt loaded. Chris stood watch, gun in hand, eyes scanning the trees. Every minute we spent out there felt like an hour. We didn't talk much, just worked fast. The donuts weren't ideal, especially on a rough forest road, but it was better than being stuck. I kept imagining someone watching us, just beyond the tree line, maybe hiding behind a fallen log or crouched behind a trunk, waiting. That thought made my skin crawl. The slashes had been fresh, we would have noticed when we first arrived. Whoever did it had been there while we were eating, maybe even before, maybe watching for a while, waiting for the right moment. Once the last spare was on, we didn't waste a second. Chris led the convoy, gun still at his side, window down, scanning. I was second. Emily's car brought up the rear. The road felt different in the dark. Tighter, longer, meaner. The shadows moved. Headlights bounced off trees in weird ways. Every bump made me grip the wheel harder, praying the spare would hold. When we finally hit the highway, the relief was like a wave. We pulled over at the first turnout with signal and called the sheriff's office. Gave them the coordinates, the road number, told them what happened. The dispatcher took the report, said someone would look into it, but you could hear it in her voice. There wasn't much they could do. No leads, no witnesses, no evidence. Just a bunch of terrified campers and 3 slashed tires. We didn't go home right away. We stopped at a gas station near Chama, filled up, bought snacks, and sat in silence in the parking lot under bright fluorescent lights. None of us said we were scared, but we all were. That feeling doesn't leave you right away. I still think about it sometimes. I still feel it, especially when I'm out in the woods alone or even driving a long dirt road with no one around. I'll remember the silence, the way the cuts all looked exactly the same, the way my stomach dropped when I realized this wasn't an accident. It was planned. Someone had been out there with us, close enough to see us, close enough to move between our vehicles without being heard. Someone who knew how to make it look surgical, clean. Someone who didn't want us to drive out. Or maybe someone who just wanted to remind us that we weren't as alone as we thought. We never found out who did it. The sheriff followed up a week later, said they drove the road and didn't see anything unusual. No squatters, no camps, no signs of recent activity. No prints, no trash, no discarded blade. Just empty forest and a worn road. We haven't camped like that since. I still go out, but never that far, never without backup plans, and never without making damn sure my car is parked where I can see it. And even now, years later, I'll sometimes wake up in a sweat thinking about it. About someone standing in the trees, watching, waiting. I was 6 years old the summer we spent most of our time at a small rental cottage deep in the hills of northern Wales. This was in 1993, and back then, the area was quieter than it is now. No mobile signal, no internet, not even a proper shop for 10 miles. My dad had found the cottage through a friend, and it was one of those places with thick stone walls, a fireplace that never quite got the room warm, and windows that whistled when the wind picked up. The kind of place most people would have left after a weekend, but my dad was the kind of person who loved being away from everything, especially since he could take me on little adventures without anyone telling him it was too dangerous for a child. He was a fit man even at 52, always moving, always dragging me up hills or through bogs. He had this strange mix of an Irish accent with bits of Northern English slang, and a habit of narrating his thoughts out loud like a children's book author. "We'll get up that slope in no time," he'd say, pointing at a grassy incline that was nearly vertical. I didn't mind. I liked being outside, even if it usually meant muddy socks, blisters, and an endless diet of boiled eggs and squash sandwiches. That summer was one of the clearest I remember. We barely had a day of rain the whole time we were there. The skies were a deep, constant blue, and the wind that came over the hills never stopped. It was never warm exactly, not even in the sun, but it felt fresh and open. You could stand on the hill behind the cottage and see little stone walls running like gray scars through the green fields for miles, with sheep like dots below. Dad would point out things like a buzzard flying overhead or the narrow remains of an old Roman road, half covered in grass, and act like I was getting a proper education. I guess in some ways I was. On one of those days, my dad decided we'd go up to the high ridge that sat above the cottage. He'd been staring at it for a few days like it was a challenge he hadn't gotten around to yet. He called it the shoulder of the land because the slope rose up steep and narrow before flattening out near the top, forming a long, broad ridge of pale grass and stubby rocks. The whole thing looked like it belonged in a painting. It was a long way up, especially for a kid my size. But my dad, being who he was, decided we'd make a full day of it. He stuffed his old army rucksack with water, sandwiches, and a small first aid kit that looked about 50 years out of date, and off we went. For the first part, I walked behind him, holding onto the bottom strap of his pack and trying not to trip on loose stones. After an hour or so, when the slope started getting more serious, he hoisted me onto his back without a word and carried me piggyback style, grumbling now and then but never slowing down. He had a way of pushing through things like it was personal. The climb took us almost 3 hours. It was hard even for him. The grass turned to rock halfway up, and we had to stop often for him to catch his breath or take a sip of water. I remember the wind getting stronger the higher we went. It made a low howling sound as it moved past the rock outcroppings, and when we reached the top, the full force of it hit us like a slap. There was no shelter up there, just flat land covered in short, dry grass, scattered with patches of moss and the occasional sheep dropping. From that ridge, you could see all the way to the coast in one direction, and inland to the deeper hills in the other. The land felt endless. There were no roads, no fences, no buildings. Just green and gold and gray, all faded slightly by distance and wind. I remember him setting me down gently on the ground, kneeling beside me to unzip the pack. He gave me a juice box and unwrapped one of the sandwiches. I was excited, babbling about how high we were and how small the cottage looked below. But he didn't answer me right away. Instead, he was staring straight ahead, not at the view, but at something maybe 100 feet away, where the flat ridge curved gently before dipping down into the next valley. I followed his gaze, expecting maybe a deer or a sheep, but there was nothing at first. Then I saw it, something sticking out of the ground. It was pale yellow, almost like old paper, with sharp corners and a boxy shape. At that age, I didn't recognize what it was, but I could tell it didn't belong there. It looked like something from a house, not a hilltop. My dad had frozen. His hand was still holding the sandwich halfway to his mouth. His face had gone pale, and his eyes were wide and hard. I didn't know how to react. He wasn't someone who ever looked unsure. He didn't flinch during thunderstorms or blink when we got too close to a cow in a field. Seeing him like that made the air feel different, like something had just gone wrong with the world. I tugged on his sleeve. Nothing. I said his name, but he didn't look at me. Then, all at once, he stood up, picked me up again, this time like a sack over his shoulder, and started walking away, fast. He didn't even pack up the food. As we moved, I twisted to look back. The pale yellow object was clearer from that angle. It had a curved top and sides, rust stains running down from the hinges, and a dented front door with a broken handle. I'd seen enough fridges in our kitchen to understand what it was. A refrigerator, just standing there, upright in the middle of nowhere. That image stuck with me for years. The weird shape of it, how out of place it looked, like someone had dropped it there from a helicopter and forgot to come back for it. But what really stayed with me was the way my dad had reacted. That silent, locked-in expression like he was seeing something I couldn't. He didn't say a word the whole way back down. Not even when we stopped for a break. Not even when we got back to the cottage and my mom asked how the hike went. I was too young to press him about it. And after a few days, other things took over. Catching frogs near the stream, collecting shiny rocks, helping Mom hang the washing out in the wind. But the image of that fridge never left my head. I'd see it sometimes before I went to sleep, just standing there in that sea of grass. Years later, well into my 20s, I brought it up again, half laughing, saying something like, "Remember that weird fridge on the hill?" He didn't laugh. He just looked at me, that same stiff, frozen look and said, "Yeah, I remember. That was when he told me the story. He said when he was a boy, back in the late 50s, he and some mates used to play in the woods behind his house in northern Yorkshire. One day, they'd found an old refrigerator dumped in the trees, half covered in leaves and dirt. Curious, they opened it. Inside, they found the body of a child. He didn't say if it was a boy or girl. He didn't say how old, just that it was small, curled up, and clearly long gone. He said they ran straight home, and his father had called the police. He remembered the flashing lights, the policeman talking quietly, the way the fridge was carried away on a stretcher like it was a coffin. He didn't talk about what happened after that, just that he never forgot it. When I asked him if seeing the fridge on the hill had reminded him of that, he paused, then shook his head slowly. It wasn't just a reminder, he said. It was the same fridge. That didn't make sense. The hill was in Wales, hundreds of miles from his home in Yorkshire, and it had been more than 30 years. Even if it had been dumped again, how could it end up on a mountaintop? I asked him if he was sure. He said he was. The handle had a crack in the exact same place. The dent in the front was identical. The model wasn't common. It had a narrow frame and a curved top, more like an icebox than a modern fridge. He swore it was the same. I didn't push him after that. He was getting older by then, and I figured maybe the memory had just overlapped with something new. Maybe the fridge had just been a similar model. The trauma could have blurred the lines, but he never brought it up again, never said another word about it. I tried to find that hill years later after he died. I went back to that area with a friend and a map. We hiked up similar ridges. Some of them looked close to what I remembered, but nothing was quite the same. We never found the fridge. I don't know if it was taken away or if I just couldn't find the right spot. The land had changed a bit. Fewer sheep, more fences. A new road carved through the valley nearby. I still think about it though. I think about the way he looked that day. Not scared like a man who'd seen something strange. Scared like someone who'd seen something impossible and couldn't make sense of it. A kind of fear that doesn't come from the thing itself, but from the way it breaks everything you believe is true. I'll never know if it was the same fridge. Logic says it couldn't be, but I believe he believed it, and maybe that's enough. I don't tell many people this story. When I do, I leave out most of the details. People laugh or they try to explain it away with theories about similar models or tricks of memory. That's fine. I'm not trying to convince anyone. All I know is what I saw. A pale yellow fridge, alone on a mountaintop. A father who went quiet, then carried me down without a word. And a story that stuck in both our minds for the rest of our lives. If you ever find yourself up in the hills of northern Wales and you come across something strange, a shape that doesn't belong, something man-made in the middle of the wild, just walk the other way. Not because it's haunted, not because it's cursed, but because sometimes the scariest things are the ones that don't make any sense at all. It was early September when I finally decided to check out the old mansion my friends had told me about. I'd been meaning to go for over a year, ever since two of my hiking buddies, Kyle and Marcus, mentioned it during a long trail out near some ridgelines west of Boulder, Colorado. They had told me about this massive, weirdly built house tucked away near a dried-up creek bed on private property. Technically, but so abandoned and overgrown that no one seemed to care. They had been there multiple times, always at night, and the way they described the place made it feel like something from another time. 4 or 5 stories tall, spiral staircases everywhere, hallways that looped back on themselves, and rooms that didn't make sense. At first, I thought they were exaggerating. They always joked around, especially when weed was involved, and I figured this place was probably just an old, rundown hunting lodge or something. But they'd shown me a few blurry pictures on their phones once. Dark shots of dusty halls, broken windows, twisted staircases, and it got stuck in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I like exploring abandoned places, especially out in the middle of nowhere. Something about walking through those kinds of places alone makes everything feel heavier, more real. I didn't go with them at the time. I had a busted knee from a bad fall earlier that spring and wasn't really up for climbing through brush or trespassing on steep terrain. But I told myself I'd go eventually once I was healed up, and I'd do it on my own. I didn't say it out loud, but I liked the idea of going there solo. No distractions, no goofing off, just me, my pack, my camera, and whatever I found inside. It wasn't until the following summer, August of 2016, that I actually made a plan. By then, I'd moved to Fort Collins for work, and I was only about an hour and a half away. I checked the weather, packed up some gear, and drove down toward the foothills near Longmont. I didn't want to go the exact way Kyle and Marcus had taken, since they mentioned some private campground that sometimes had a groundskeeper around, and I didn't want to risk a run-in. I ended up parking about a mile and a half away, near a bend in a forestry service road that was more pothole than pavement, and started hiking in from there. The approach was slow, hot, dry, and overgrown. I followed a game trail most of the way using a topo map I printed out ahead of time. I crossed 2 old barbed wire fences that looked like they hadn't been maintained in years. Everything felt forgotten. After maybe an hour and a half of hiking, I saw the roofline up ahead, just peeking through some twisted pines. The house or mansion really looked even bigger than I expected. It was shaped almost like a letter H if you looked at it from above, with the central section taller than the 2 wings on either side. The siding was faded and cracked, a kind of slate blue color that had gone dull from the sun. Vines were growing up one side. Several of the second-story windows were shattered, and parts of the roof sagged. But the structure was still holding on. It was clear no one had lived there in a long time, but I could tell it hadn't been torched or completely gutted like some places I've explored before. I walked up the cracked concrete driveway, which curved a little before ending in a circular lot filled with weeds. Broken glass crunched under my boots. The front door was missing, just gone, leaving a yawning dark rectangle in the middle of a tall portico. I stood there for a moment, checking the windows, listening. Nothing moved. The trees were still, and the only sound was a soft, constant hum from cicadas or grasshoppers somewhere in the brush. I stepped inside. The entryway was massive. Tall ceilings, a wide open space, dusty wood floors warped in places from water damage. Dead leaves and debris were scattered everywhere, and sunlight streamed in from a series of long, narrow windows along the top of the front wall. Immediately in front of me, a wide spiral staircase curved up to the left. It looked like solid oak, but the railings were cracked, and several steps had splintered edges. I took a few cautious steps in and stopped again, trying to take it all in. The air smelled like dry rot and old smoke. I pulled out my phone and snapped a few pictures. Most of them came out poorly lit, but I figured I could clean them up later. I moved slowly, my hiking boots thudding against the hollow floor as I made my way into the main part of the house. The layout made no sense. It felt like it had been built in sections, each with a slightly different design style, and none of them quite matched. Some walls had wood paneling, others were cracked plaster with old floral wallpaper peeling off in long curls. There were no straight staircases. Everyone I found was spiral, either going up or down, and each was built with a different kind of railing or step. One of them, in the far right wing, had metal steps with no backings so you could see all the way down as you climbed. That one freaked me out a little. I spent over an hour just wandering. I found maybe 20 different rooms, bedrooms, kitchens, closets, strange little nooks. Some had furniture still in them, broken and scattered. One room had a crib in the corner, with a rotten mattress collapsed in the middle. Another had what looked like a full bar, complete with mirror-backed shelves and dusty liquor bottles still lined up. One bathroom had vines growing in through the broken window and around the porcelain of the sink. But the weirdest part was how often I thought I was in a new area, only to realize I'd looped back to somewhere familiar. I'd go up a staircase in one wing, walk down a hallway, open a door, and end up back in the entryway again. It didn't feel like a trick or a mistake in my memory. It felt designed that way, like a maze built into the structure of the house. It started to make me feel strange, like I was walking in circles even when I wasn't. Eventually, I found the master bedroom. It was up another spiral staircase, this one tucked just left of the main entryway, almost hidden behind a protruding wall. The bedroom took up most of the 3rd floor. Massive ceilings, broken ceiling fan, and torn curtains that fluttered slightly even though there was no breeze. The bed frame was still there, tilted to one side, and a giant closet stood with its doors half open. I found a deck through a shattered sliding glass door, covered in leaves and dirt, but with a view that stretched for miles across the tree line. I stepped out for a second, but the soft creaking of the boards beneath my feet made me come back inside fast. At the center of the room was one final spiral staircase, thin, narrow, and steep, leading up to a smaller space, almost like a tower room or study. It had windows on 3 sides, mostly intact, and a broken desk pushed up against one wall. An elevator door stood in the far corner, sealed shut. I tried to pry it open, but it didn't budge. There was no power in the house, so even if it had worked once, it wasn't going to work now. I spent maybe 10 minutes up there, just taking photos and looking out the windows. I didn't notice anyone watching, and I didn't hear anything, but later I learned someone must have seen me moving around up there from one of the neighboring properties. Maybe they assumed I was looting or squatting or worse. When I came back down to the master bedroom, I felt uneasy. Nothing had changed exactly, but the silence in the house had deepened. I remember thinking that the lower levels still needed to be explored, but the thought of going down into the basement, where there were no windows, suddenly didn't appeal to me. The stairwells got narrower the lower they went, and the air down there had a damp, choking quality I didn't like. I took a few steps toward the central staircase again, meaning to go down just a little further, but the moment I turned the corner and looked into the shadows of that spiral descent, I changed my mind. The light from my flashlight barely reached the bottom, and I could see just how tight the turns got. It didn't feel like a basement, it felt like a cave. I turned around, went back to the entryway, and that's when I saw them. 2 police SUVs were parked in the driveway. I could see the red and blue lights bouncing off the inside walls through the open doorway. I dropped into a crouch and backed into a side room without thinking. I wasn't doing anything dangerous or destructive, but technically I was trespassing, and I didn't have a good excuse for being there. I waited maybe 5 minutes, heart thudding in my chest, sweat sticking my shirt to my back. I could hear voices outside, but no footsteps inside the house. I started to wonder if they'd even come in, or if maybe they'd just leave. But the longer I stayed there, the more wrong it felt. Something about hiding made the whole place feel suddenly threatening, like I was being cornered. So I stepped out. I walked to the door with my hands visible, and I shouted that I was coming out. They met me on the steps. I won't go into all the boring stuff. They searched me, found the little pipe and grinder I kept in my camera bag, asked a bunch of questions. No one was aggressive. They were calm but serious, told me I shouldn't be there, that the place had been marked off due to structural danger. One of the older cops looked me up and down and told me he wouldn't have set foot in that house if he didn't have to. After that, they walked me to my car, which I admitted was parked off-road. They didn't find me, but they did say not to come back or next time it wouldn't be so simple. That was the last time I saw the mansion. I meant to go back and dig through some of my old pictures and maybe upload them somewhere, but a few years and several laptops later, I've only got one left. It's just a blurry shot of the overgrown driveway leading up through the trees, with the roofline barely visible at the top. The rest are probably gone, lost in old hard drives or dead computers. I still think about that place sometimes. Not in a scary way exactly, more like something. I still think about that night sometimes. Not every day, not all the time, but every now and then it hits me. Usually when I'm alone, driving at night, or sitting by myself under the stars. It creeps in slowly, the memory of it, the way some shadows move when they shouldn't, or how a chill runs up your back even when it's warm out. I don't tell many people about what happened. The few times I tried, they either looked at me like I was exaggerating or got that distant look in their eyes like they didn't know what to say. I get it. You kind of had to be there, but I'll tell it here. Exactly how I remember it. All of it. It was July 2006. I had just turned 17, living in a quiet town in Washington called Ridgeport. Nothing exciting ever happened there. You knew everyone by name, and if something unusual did happen, everyone knew about it by morning. I had 3 close friends that summer: Derek, Matt, and Emily. We had grown up together. Emily was the only girl in our group, but we didn't think of it that way. We were just the 4 of us, always had been. That summer, we were doing everything we could to squeeze in whatever kind of excitement we could find before senior year started. We had heard about a meteor shower from some website Matt's older brother sent him. Said it would peak around midnight and would be brightest if you were up high, away from the town lights. We'd gone hiking a bunch of times before, so we thought it'd be cool to hike up Hollow Pines Trail and watch it from the summit. Hollow Pines wasn't a huge mountain. It was more like a long, forested ridge with one main trail that curved and climbed up to a big clearing at the top. It was about a 2-hour hike if you took your time. Not too steep, just a slow, steady climb through a lot of dense trees. We'd done it a couple of times before during the day, never at night, but that was the appeal. We met at Derek's house around 9:30 p.m., packed our backpacks with a few snacks, water bottles, flashlights, and some sweatshirts in case it got cold up there. Matt's old Toyota pickup was our ride, and we all piled in. Emily brought one of those cheap foam mats to sit on, and I remember teasing her for thinking we were going on a picnic. By the time we got to the trailhead, it was already getting dark. There were no streetlights out there. The parking lot was just a gravel patch off the side of a narrow road with room for maybe 6 or 7 cars. Ours was the only one there. We thought that was perfect. No crowd, no noise, just us and the stars. The air was warm and still. The sky had that deep blue color it gets right before it turns completely black. We each turned on our flashlights and started up the trail. The first half mile was just gentle walking, the path wide enough for 2 people side by side. The woods on either side were thick with pine and fir trees, with the occasional fallen log or boulder. The forest felt huge, like it just went on forever. We didn't say much at first, just walked and listened to the crunch of boots on dirt and pine needles. Every now and then one of us would stop to shine a light on a weird-looking stump or check out some rustling in the bushes. The kind of harmless curiosity you get when you're a teenager and nothing bad has ever really happened to you. About halfway up, we stopped to rest. There was a big rock off to the side of the trail where the trees opened up a little. You could see the glow of Ridgeport down in the valley, just a soft orange glow in the distance. We drank some water, passed around a bag of trail mix, and took turns sitting on the rock. That's when we noticed him. At first, it didn't even register that someone was behind us. Just a faint light coming through the trees. A flickering, bouncing kind of light like someone holding a flashlight and walking. I thought maybe it was another group hiking up, but I didn't hear any voices. Just the light. We all stopped talking and watched. The light moved slowly but steadily closer, and finally the shape behind it came into view. It was a man, alone, probably mid-30s, wearing what looked like a dark business suit. It looked completely out of place. Who hikes up a mountain at night in dress shoes and a blazer? We all kind of exchanged looks. Something didn't feel right, but none of us said anything. We were just 4 teenagers sitting on a rock, and here was this random adult walking alone in the woods at night, dressed like he'd just come from a meeting. We stood up and started walking again. Not fast, just casually. We didn't want to act weird, but I could tell we were all thinking the same thing. This guy was strange. The trail narrowed a little after that. The trees closed in more tightly and the path wound around some bigger boulders. We kept glancing back. The man was still behind us, maybe 40 or 50 feet. Always just far enough to be out of earshot, but close enough to keep pace. We sped up a little. When we stopped again, about 20 minutes later, he was much closer. Maybe 10 feet away, just standing there like he was waiting for us to say something or invite him to pass. But he didn't pass. He just stood there and stared at us with this flat, blank look on his face. That's when it got uncomfortable. We didn't know what to do. We didn't want to talk to him. We didn't want him walking with us either. But we also didn't want to be rude or get into something worse. So we just started walking again. A little faster this time. He followed. I remember looking at his shoes. Black leather dress shoes, shiny even in the dark. Every time he stepped on a loose rock or uneven part of the trail, he kind of staggered a bit like he wasn't used to hiking. His clothes were totally out of place. No backpack, no water, no flashlight of his own. He was using the dim trail lights or maybe the moonlight, I couldn't tell. After about another 30 minutes, we reached the summit. It was just a flat open space with short grass and a few logs where people could sit. There was a wide view of the sky and a perfect spot to watch the meteor shower. We spread out our mats and sat down, trying not to act like we were watching him, but we were. He sat down too, way too close to Emily. Not next to her. practically on top of her. She looked uncomfortable. She leaned away, and I could tell by the way she kept shifting and fidgeting that she didn't want to be anywhere near him. None of us did. The air had turned cold, and the whole thing felt wrong now. I kept thinking about how isolated we were. No other hikers, no cell service, no way to call for help. Just us, this guy, and miles of trees. We only stayed up there for maybe 15 minutes. I didn't care about the meteor shower anymore. Neither did Derek or Matt. Emily looked pale. Her eyes never stopped moving. I stood up and grabbed my backpack, made up some excuse for why we had to leave early. I didn't even care if he heard or thought it was weird. I just wanted us gone. We started walking down, fast, almost a jog. I kept checking over my shoulder every few minutes. I didn't see him at first. Then, maybe 5 minutes into the descent, I saw the flashlight. He was behind us again, still following. Only this time, he didn't try to keep his distance. He moved faster, like he was trying to close the gap. I told the others quietly to pick up the pace. We were half running now, stumbling on rocks, sliding in loose dirt. The trail was rougher going down, and none of us wanted to fall, but we also didn't want to stop. About a mile from the trailhead, we rounded a bend and finally saw the gravel lot below through the trees. It was such a relief. Just the shape of the truck in the moonlight felt like salvation. We sprinted the last few hundred yards and piled into the truck. Matt fumbled with the keys, started the engine, and threw it into reverse. That's when Derek, who was in the back seat, shouted something and pointed. The man was running full speed down the trail, and he was carrying a stick, a big one, maybe a branch or a walking stick, but he was holding it like a weapon. He was running straight at us, full tilt, suit jacket flapping behind him, eyes wide and wild. We didn't wait to see what he wanted. Matt slammed on the gas and tore out of the lot, gravel kicking up behind the tires. I turned in my seat and watched as the man reached the edge of the lot, just barely missing us. He stopped, panting, and then just stood there, staring as we disappeared down the road. None of us said a word for a long time. We just sat there in silence, adrenaline still pumping, hearts racing. We didn't know what that guy wanted, but it didn't feel random. It didn't feel like some harmless weirdo. There was something off about him, like he wasn't right in the head or worse. We drove straight back to Derek's house, parked, and sat in the driveway for a while. Emily was shaking. Matt couldn't stop rubbing his hands on his jeans. We told ourselves he must have been high, or drunk, or maybe just insane. But even then, it didn't make sense. Why was he there? Why us? 2 days later, we found out. Derek sent us a link to a local news site. There had been an article about a man arrested not far from Hollow Pines. The night of the meteor shower, a woman had been found dead along a different trail just across the ridge, strangled. Another woman's body was found that morning not far from a service road. Same cause. The man suspected of both was picked up the next day at a motel. His name was Peter Halwell, 37, married, a sales rep from Tacoma. He had murdered his wife earlier that week, then vanished. They said he had mental issues. They found a notebook in his motel room filled with pages of It was in the summer of 2011, late July. I was 15 at the time, and my dad had taken a few days off work so we could do one of our little trips. Just the two of us, away from people, away from phones, away from everything. We'd always liked that sort of thing. My dad was the kind of guy who grew up doing things like fishing, camping, hunting, building fires with just sticks and a pocket knife. He liked passing that stuff down to me, and I liked being out there with him. We weren't exactly rich or anything, but those trips made me feel like the luckiest kid in the world. That summer, we drove out to a remote campground about 20 miles east of Priest River, Idaho. The place was called Gray Birch Flats, and it wasn't even marked on most maps. Dad had found it through some old forestry records a few years before. It was deep in the woods, surrounded by dense pine forest and a narrow, glassy lake that almost looked black in the right light. There were no designated camping spots, no bathrooms, no services. Just a dirt road, a rough pull-off by the lake, and a whole lot of forest. We got there in the late afternoon after driving for nearly 6 hours. It was hot, Even up there, the kind of thick heat that makes your shirt stick to your back when you carry anything heavy. We set up our old canvas tent near the water's edge under a stand of cedar trees. There wasn't anyone else around, not that I expected there to be. We hadn't passed a single vehicle on that road after turning off the main highway, and the trail was so narrow and overgrown I had to keep getting out to move branches just so the truck wouldn't get scratched up too badly. That first evening was quiet. We cooked dinner over the fire, just hot dogs and beans, nothing fancy, and sat there watching the sky turn purple and then black. The stars out there were insane. I remember how loud the crickets were, how still the water was, like a sheet of steel in the moonlight. It felt like we were the only two people left in the world. Around 10 or so, we climbed into our tent and crashed hard. The next morning, we woke up early. We ate some granola and jerky and planned to hike along the edge of the lake. Dad said that if we followed the shoreline long enough and veered into the woods at a certain point, we'd hit a waterfall that spilled down into a rock basin. He'd seen it on an old survey map. It wasn't a marked trail, more of a bushwhack job, but that was part of the fun. We packed a couple bottles of water, a small first aid kit, some trail mix, and his old 9mm just in case we ran into bears or a moose. We started moving around mid-morning. The forest felt dense but not creepy, just quiet. The lake shimmered beside us on the left, and the slope on the right climbed upward sharply, covered in ferns, fallen logs, and thick underbrush. It was slow going. We had to push through brush, climb over rotten logs, and navigate the soft, uneven ground. About an hour in, we came across a slash pile. It looked fresh. That was odd, because we hadn't seen any signs of people, no boot prints, no tire tracks, nothing. The pile itself was about waist high and made up of branches, broken sticks, and bark. But what really caught my eye was what was sitting on top. A single child's shoe. A small, red canvas sneaker. Worn but not filthy, like it had been placed there on purpose. Neither of us said anything at first. We just kind of stood there looking at it. I remember glancing around to see if maybe there were other signs of someone nearby, but the forest was still and empty. After maybe 20 seconds, Dad stepped forward and picked up the shoe. He turned it over once, then put it back. I could tell it made him uncomfortable, but he didn't want to spook me. I was old enough to read his face, though. He didn't like it. We kept going. Another 40 minutes or so passed. The terrain started to change. Less brush, more open space. We came into a small clearing where the trees broke just enough to let some light through. The ferns were waist high, and the air felt oddly still, like the breeze had just stopped. My dad told me to hold up for a minute. He had to take a leak. He stepped to one side of the clearing, turned his back, and I turned the opposite way, facing the woods. That's when I heard it. Clear as day, a child's voice said, "I'm over here." I froze. I wasn't imagining it. It was a little girl's voice, young, maybe 6 or 7 years old. Soft but loud enough to carry. It didn't come from far off either. It sounded like it came from just past the tree line, maybe 20, 30 feet into the woods. I turned around immediately and looked at Dad. He was already zipping up and looking at me. His eyes were wide. I knew what he was thinking because I was thinking the same thing. He thought it was me, but I hadn't said anything. He stepped closer and we both just stared into the trees. We walked in slowly, checking the ferns, calling out. Not loudly, just kind of softly, like we didn't want to disturb something. We looked for any sign. Footprints, disturbed grass, anything. But there was nothing. No movement, no other sounds. Just the buzz of insects and the occasional creak of trees shifting in the wind. We spent over half an hour combing the area. It wasn't big, maybe an acre or two of forest beyond the clearing. But there was no sign of anyone. And if there had been someone, they would have had to run off silently and fast, which didn't make much sense. There were dead branches everywhere, soft ground, steep terrain. You couldn't move fast without making a racket. Eventually, Dad called it. He didn't say anything, just gave me a nod and started heading back the way we came. I followed without asking questions. I knew he was spooked. We didn't talk for the first part of the hike back. The air felt different, heavier, more tense. Every noise felt louder. At first, I thought it was just because we were freaked out, but then I started noticing things. like the way certain bushes would rustle a little too long after we passed, or how I'd hear a twig snap behind us but nothing was there. At one point, we both stopped and turned around at the same time because we heard what sounded like something breathing, slow and heavy, but when we looked, there was just trees and silence. Then came the following. Started small, just the feeling of being watched. That prickly, skin-crawling tension on the back of your neck. Then came the clear, deliberate sounds. Twigs snapping, brush moving. We stopped a few times, waited in silence, but whatever it was never showed itself. I asked once if maybe it was an animal. Dad gave a small shake of his head. Bears usually don't stalk people that quietly, and deer or elk would have run by now. Whatever it was smart enough to stay just out of sight but close enough to make us know it was there. Every few minutes, something would move just off the path behind us. By the time we got back to camp, the sun was starting to dip low. The shadows had stretched long across the lake. The place felt off, like it wasn't ours anymore. We didn't say much. We packed up faster than usual. The tent came down in minutes. Everything got thrown into the truck bed without being folded or stored right. As Dad started the engine, I looked back toward the tree line. I don't know what I was expecting to see. Maybe nothing, but I thought I saw movement just behind the brush. Something low. Not an animal, not a person. Just a quick shadow slipping between trees. I didn't say anything. We left. The drive back was quiet. We didn't talk much. Just the occasional check-in. You all right? Yeah, that kind of thing. We got home late, past midnight. I went straight to bed without brushing my teeth. My mind just kept playing the hike over and over. The shoe, the voice, the snapping twigs, that awful, gut-deep feeling of being followed by something just out of view. We never went back to Gray Birch Flats. A few months later, I tried looking up any information about the area. I found nothing. No reports. No missing kids. No weird local legends. Just trees and dirt and water. Like nothing ever happened out there. Like we imagined it. But I know we didn't. I know what I heard. I know what we both felt. My dad never brought it up again. And honestly, I didn't want him to. I think we both knew something was wrong out there. Maybe it was a person. Maybe some weirdo living off-grid or some backwoods trapper who didn't want us there. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Strange sounds and nothing else. But the feeling I had, the certainty that something was out there watching us, following us, that's something I'll never forget. That was the last time we ever camped somewhere without a ranger station nearby. From that point on, every trip was a public site with people around and cell service if possible. I don't blame my dad. He was just trying to give me a good experience. But that hike changed something in both of us. Even now, all these years later, I still think about that trip. I still see the red shoe. I still hear that voice saying, "I'm over here." I still remember the way the trees shifted, the way the silence felt like it was holding its breath. And I still get that sick, cold feeling in my gut every time I think about how lucky we might have been to make it out without finding out what was really in those woods. Because I don't think it wanted to be found.